Calvin strolled down the street, scrutinizing his surroundings. His experience told him that in life, as in the forest, it was important to be attentive and observant. Here, for example, there under the lamp shines a coin that looks like a small button. You pick it up, and you immediately feel happy. Even though it's a trifle, it's still pleasant. Change to change, and you'll have enough for a loaf of bread, and that's something. Calvin's stomach rumbled indignantly at the thought of food. He lowered his eyes in embarrassment. I hope the passers-by didn't hear that sound, he thought. Actually, Calvin always tried to look decent so he wouldn't be mistaken for a homeless person. He washed his clothes in the river or went to a laundromat where a watchman he knew worked. Benjamin treated Calvin as a friend, did not offend him, could lend him money or share his lunch. Eat, Calvin, eat. I can't eat too much, I've got an ulcer. My wife cooks, but it's very good. So I got more for you, the older man said. Calvin just nodded and ate the food with pleasure. It was so good. What can't be said at the thought of it? The boy thought dreamily and closed his eyes for a moment. At the same instant, he felt a slight nudge in his shoulder, which clearly couldn't have been an accident. Calvin froze and looked at the troublemaker in surprise. Half a metro away from him stood a guy whose clothes made him look like a successful businessman. Can't you see it all? Where are you going? The stranger asked. Calvin was embarrassed, but decided not to respond to the barbs. He realized he shouldn't make enemies out of nothing. Sorry, I got distracted, he mumbled, and was about to walk past when the rich man shoved him rather roughly in the shoulder again. Wait, we need to talk. How are you doing with your free time? He asked. Calvin looked at the businessman in surprise. What could they talk about if they were so different that friendship between them was possible only in a fairy tale world of someone's fantasy? Nevertheless, Calvin was interested in the proposal. He could apparently tell him something special regarding a job, or at least a temporary income. I don't mind as long as it's only for a short time, the boy said. I'm running out of time. Calvin pointed to a quiet, inconspicuous shop under a canopy of trees. My name is Clifford. If anything, Clifford Williams is an acquaintance. Calvin felt uneasy under his scrutinizing gaze. After all, he knew that, despite all the contrivances, he looked like a tramp, or at least a man of low social status. I'm Calvin. Well, what are we going to talk about? Asked, in turn, the homeless man. Clifford thought for a moment and said, Well, I will not go round and round. In general, so mate. I have a very interesting proposition for you. Tonight I have a date with my fiancée at a restaurant. She and I have been on social media for a long time, texting each other. Now it's time for us to meet and see each other in person. You know. Calvin shook his head, perplexed. What's that got to do with me? I need someone to go instead of me. You, for instance. Clifford smiled. And then immediately added, I'll give you some clothes, take you to a bath, a hairdresser. Anyway, you'll have to show up at the place at 7:30 tonight. I think I've made myself pretty clear. Calvin raised an eyebrow in surprise. Well, you are. Well, I can't just go out on a date. Imagine if a stranger from the street went on a date with your fiancée instead of you. Is that normal? Calvin bit his lip painfully. But we only knew her in absentia. We corresponded on an online dating site. Most of the time we even had animals instead of avatars. I mean, no faces, you know. I had a cat, she had a cat. Clifford's story seemed rather odd to Calvin. What site is this major talking about anyway, and what does he want with it? Clifford noticed the doubt in the boy's eyes and immediately continued. Don't worry, there's no crime there. It's just an anonymous dating network where everyone has animals instead of photos, so that, before seeing each other, people can communicate without any visual component. Yeah, there's a lot of things being invented these days. Don't you agree? I owe you a decent salary and everything. You can keep your clothes and shoes. Calvin thought about it. Why don't you want to go on this date yourself? Why this circus with dressing up? Clifford smiled. Because I don't know the appearance of the girl who will come to the restaurant. And what if there is some, excuse my French, hippopotamus there? I don't need that kind of familiarity, you see. But you'll come, you'll make conversation. I'll watch from the sidelines. Calvin frowned. But what's stopping you from just coming to the restaurant and watching her from the sidelines? Why all the spectacle? Clifford grumbled unhappily. Look, mate, do you need money? Because I see you're asking too many questions. If not, I'll find another performer. Clifford looked mockingly at the tramp. Believe me, there are plenty of hunters for such a simple job. Calvin nodded, still not knowing what to do in this situation. Of course, in his position as a hobo, he could have agreed without looking, but something seemed to keep him from making a final decision. All this time, Clifford looked at the tramp with a sneer that hurt his ego. All right, I'll do it, said Calvin, just as long as it's fair and without any nastiness. I know you rich people are fond of all sorts of pranks, so that you can mock a man and make a laughing stock of him. Clifford's face became serious at once. I understand, mate, he said. It'll be all right. You'll just come and sit in a restaurant, have a nice dinner, and talk to a nice girl. Well, maybe not so nice, but it depends. I didn't even see her face. Well, do we have a deal? The Major asked and held out his white, slightly puffy palm to Calvin. The tramp responded to the handshake, mentally picturing himself in an expensive suit and sitting in a fancy establishment. Clifford was silent for a moment, then said, "If you're ready to start, I'll take you to the city bath now. Then to the hairdressers. They'll do your hair, your size. We're about the same size, I see, so I'll give you my suit and my shoes. They're brand new, I haven't worn them, so my outfit will be just right for you. Oh, and I almost forgot." Calvin's heart began to race, but the Major immediately added, "The girl may not come alone, so don't be embarrassed, improvise as you go." "All right, I'll try," Calvin muttered sullenly. Deep down, he knew he was getting into another adventure, and he didn't know why he was doing it. Is it for the money? I don't think so. Most likely it was because the guy just wanted to feel all this luxury, at least for one evening, that the waiter would bring a dish at his first call. The doorman would open the door obligingly, and the girl sitting in the hall would stare at him. Of course, it was all just fantasy, and Calvin understood that as well as anyone. Even if he put on a rich man's suit, he would still be the same homeless man who wandered the city 24 hours a day, looking for a part-time job and a shipment of recyclables. Meanwhile, Clifford pointed to his car and invited him to sit in the passenger seat. At the sight of the Major's spectacular SUV, Calvin bit his lip regretfully. No, it wasn't black envy. Not at all. It was more sadness that he was living his life so aimlessly, digging through rubbish and socializing with outcasts like himself. Upon arrival at the bathhouse, Clifford had rented a suite for Calvin with all the amenities, massage, jacuzzi, with therapeutic oils and mineral supplements. Such luxury Calvin had never seen before. He bathed mostly in the same river where he washed his clothes, and at night he caught crayfish. To avoid starvation, when the catch was particularly good, he sold them to local resellers. In turn, the homegrown businessmen sold them for a different price. Since Calvin had no fishing equipment, he used his hands to pull the crayfish out of the river, which was dangerous. Once he was even bitten by a snake, which turned out to be a snake and did not carry any poison in its teeth. But after this incident, the sense of danger never left the young tramp. Unfortunately, crayfish fishing did not bring him a steady income, because in winter it was almost impossible to get them, especially in the way that Calvin used. After the bath, Clifford took him to the barber. The girl at the reception desk immediately offered to choose the right hairstyle, and that's where Calvin was really confused. The thing was that he had never been to a barber shop in his life. Most of the time he got his hair cut at one of the social centers where vagrants were given minimal help. There was no range of haircuts there, of course, and he had to content himself with getting a machine cut every time. Clifford grinned, then winked at the master. "All right, I'll leave you for a bit. Anyway, you'll figure it out without me." As it turned out a little later, Clifford was not a regular at the saloon, although, sitting behind the wheel of the car, he told Calvin that he visited here almost every week. To the young vagabond, it all seemed an incredible luxury. On the other hand, it remained to be seen how he would have behaved with the kind of financial resources Clifford had. Sitting in the barber's chair, Calvin felt uncomfortable. It seemed to him that there were a whole bunch of needles in the chair, pricking him and not letting him relax. Every minute he felt like the girls were laughing at him or trying to play a joke on him. But that, of course, was not the case. Sneaking a glance at his watch, Calvin noticed that the time was approaching noon, which meant that he would have to show up at the restaurant in a few hours. Stepping out of the saloon, Calvin immediately spotted Clifford's conspicuous SUV. The rich guy was sitting there listening to music. Seeing the visibly transformed vagrant, he smiled and handed him a bag with clothes and shoes. Also inside was an expensive smartphone and a watch. "This is my gift to you. At the end of our event, as agreed, you can keep everything. Or sell it. It's up to you," Clifford said. Calvin's eyes flashed with joy. He hadn't even thought of selling. In fact, the lad wanted to prolong this feeling of wealth and self-importance. "Thank you very much," he said discreetly. Clifford smiled, and a sly sparkle gleamed in his eyes. "Look, mate, it's certainly a good thing. I've turned you into a businessman, but now it's your turn. Help me transform into a tramp so the girl doesn't recognize me." Calvin looked at the rich guy anxiously. Is he joking? What if he laughs now and says it's all a joke? But Clifford spoke quite seriously. "Then your hair should be ruined, of course, and all that styling and gel washed off, and also your face, to make it dirty. Well, and your clothes, of course, your clothes won't fit. If you have any servants, a janitor or a gardener, take them and pile them in the dust and put them on yourself. Well, then you'll look like a tramp," advised Calvin. Clifford listened attentively, as if it really mattered to him. Calvin, on the other hand, was getting more and more into the role of the rich man. Of course, he realized that it wasn't real and didn't mean much. But on the other hand, could this be his chance? At the same time, Calvin still did not understand the motives that moved Clifford. Why would he go to such trouble when he could do so much more easily? As they waited for the evening, The time dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Throughout this period, the young people sat in Clifford's SUV and listened to the radio. The rich guy himself was already dressed in some old clothes and looked like a street hobo. He grinned and added, "Oh, I almost forgot. My fiance's name is Amanda. She says she'll be wearing a red dress, so you'll recognize her straight away." "Well, how will you recognize her?" "Go to her and don't be afraid of anything. Act as relaxed as possible. A confident woman is attracted to that. Then the restaurant staff won't pick on you. They'll think you're just another rich guy who wandered in for a tasty snack," Clifford continued. "And I'll give you a bank card as payment. When you've chosen your meal, a waiter or waitress will come to you for your order, and you'll hand them your card. They'll take it from there. I've got all the protection I need on it." Calvin shook his head uncertainly. "A bank card? Or maybe cash would be better. Somehow I don't really get along with those cards. To be honest, I've held them in my hand a couple of times in my life, and those were credit cards that people dropped or threw away." Clifford laughed. "Don't worry, the card won't bite you. You'll be fine. The main thing is to act confident. Feel like you're in charge of your life. You came to the restaurant to get good emotions, and all those receptionists, waiters, and doormen should provide it for you, but in exchange for money, of course." As the hand of the clock slowly approached 6, Calvin experienced an incredible inner excitement. Understanding his condition, Clifford nodded discreetly and offered to leave the cozy interior of the SUV. Once outside, Calvin felt completely defenseless and helpless. It suddenly seemed to him that he was not wearing a business suit at all, but some ridiculous outfit which at any moment could make passers-by laugh, making him a laughingstock. Calvin took a couple of steps towards the restaurant. At the same time, he managed to catch the assessing glances of passers-by who looked at him, if not with envy, then at least with respect or hidden inner support. When the guy approached the door of the restaurant, he obviously didn't expect the doorman to immediately open the door for him. Calvin wanted to say thank you, but then changed his mind and limited himself to a modest nod. The doorman looked at him so devotedly that he knew at once that he wanted a tip, and since Calvin didn't have any cash, he decided to leave it for later. The restaurant was very crowded. Live music was playing from the stage. A singer in a blue dress sang in such a heartfelt voice that the young man's heart literally snapped. "Why did I get into all this?" Calvin thought. "If it gets out, I'll be the laughingstock of the world. On the other hand, what am I now? Do I have anything to be proud of?" He looked around the room and realized that the girl in the red dress wasn't even there. "That's a shame. What do we do now?" Calvin thought. Clifford's good, too, by the way. Hadn't bothered to give him any instructions on the matter. The excitement was getting worse. He suddenly felt his cheeks turn red with shame and a sticky sweat appeared on his forehead. What if they find out I'm a tramp? They'll start shouting it out, I thought again. In reality, of course, this did not happen, because the restaurant lived its usual life, in which some people had a beautiful holiday, and others provided them with this very holiday. True, for a fee, according to set rates. As Calvin froze like a statue in the middle of the room, the receptionist in a suit and horn-rimmed glasses immediately approached him. After assessing the guest with an attentive eye, he said, "Good evening, young man. Are you looking for a free table? Then I recommend you sit over there by the window. It's a very good place to look around and see what's what. You must be a traveler." "Am I right?" the receptionist asked. Calvin nodded and grasped the opportunity gladly. He also realized at once that his future strategy would be to pretend to be a visiting rich man who was not familiar with the local peculiarities. "Well, let me show you out and get the waitress. What kind of dishes do you prefer? European cuisine or something from our native classics? Or maybe something spicy, Caucasian for example, or something completely exotic?" the receptionist asked. Calvin shrugged his shoulders and added, "Let's have something from our cuisine, but something that is understandable and native." The receptionist smiled contentedly. At that moment, it seemed to Calvin that he could see right through him, and had long ago figured out the whole show. However, the administrator turned out to be a real professional, and soon on the table in front of the guest were delicious borscht with sour cream, a portion of herring, some salad, and something else from the local dishes. The hungry boy was dizzy from such abundance, but it was not the number of dishes that confused the tramp most of all, but a set of cutlery, the meaning of which was unknown to him. How to use this knife and fork, and in what hand to take them. The question of how to use cutlery was so difficult for him that Calvin regretted choosing those dishes that featured meat and borscht. "I wish I'd ordered something simpler. Something I could eat with a spoon," he thought. "And here it's nothing but trouble." As he took the spoon in his hands, Calvin felt a shiver of excitement. It seemed to him that he was not holding cutlery, but some clever instrument that he would have to learn to use long and painfully. Calvin glanced round the room again, but the girl in red was still gone. "Maybe Clifford's just fooled me and is sitting round the corner laughing," he thought. On the other hand, nothing bad has happened yet. Especially in his pocket was a bank card which could be used to pay for any order, even the most expensive. Soon a rather strange couple appeared in the hall. They looked to be about 50. A woman in a strict dress with a purse in her hands and a man whose head seemed to be completely gray. They called the receptionist over to them and spoke quietly to him about something. For some inexplicable reason, Calvin experienced a severe anxiety attack, especially after he saw the receptionist pointing his hand at him. The guy suddenly felt uneasy. What if he wanted to accuse him of lying and would do it right now in front of the whole audience? Meanwhile, the strange couple approached Calvin and sat down at his table. The man looked at the guy with a heavy, unpleasant look, as if he expected that the one sitting opposite the couple should be the first to start the conversation. Calvin realized that something not quite right had happened, and the whole idea was doomed to failure from the start. "So what, young man? Are you just going to sit there and stare at us?" the stranger asked defiantly. Calvin shook his head incomprehensibly. "I'm sorry, what am I supposed to do? I'm actually here for a date with Amanda." The man and woman looked at each other again with that look that made the guy immediately feel sick, and his appetite disappeared as if it never existed. "My name is Mrs. Beatrice, and this is my husband, Mr. Frederick. You've probably decided to mock us, young man, but you won't succeed. Is that why you made this appointment?" she began. "I didn't make it," Calvin wondered, feeling embarrassed at having to lie to these seemingly nice people. Meanwhile, Mrs. Beatrice continued. "Yes, who else would it be? You were the one who made the appointment, and you knew perfectly well that our daughter had died about a month ago." "Died how? What about the date?" Calvin marveled. "What kind of date can there be when our daughter is resting in a cemetery? Why, you scoundrel, mocking our feelings. What, you want to play hard to get? You bastard. You were her secret boyfriend, weren't you?" All the while, the one she'd been buying gifts for stepped into the conversation. "Cars at your first request," Mr. Frederick said sharply, switching to you. At that moment, Calvin realized that he needed to leave the restaurant immediately before the situation turned into a huge scandal. But when he called the waiter to pay with the card issued by Clifford, an unpleasant circumstance came to light. It turned out that the card actually belonged not to the rich man, but to the late Amanda. As luck would have it, the card was immediately identified by Mr. Frederick and Mrs. Beatrice, who immediately grabbed Calvin by the arms and unanimously asked the receptionist to call the police. Calvin tried to break free, but his strength suddenly left him, replaced by a feeling of hopeless longing and sadness. The police responded surprisingly quickly and arrived at the restaurant in 10 minutes. But the most surprising thing awaited Calvin ahead. When his pockets were checked, a passport in the name of Clifford Williams was found in one of them. "But it's not mine," Calvin shouted. Immediately he saw his photograph in it. At that moment the lad realized wistfully that he had run into some clever scam. "So that's what you are, a crook. Well, now you'll have to answer for all your crimes," exclaimed Mr. Frederick angrily. Never before had Calvin been so ashamed. He tried to explain to the policeman that he was not really Clifford Williams, but Calvin Wilson, a tramp from the street. But how could he prove it when his own papers had been replaced with forged ones? Hoping to find Clifford's support, Calvin began to look around and look around. Clifford was already gone. The guests of the restaurant looked with disapproval at the guy who had been caught with the gun card of a girl who had died a month ago. At the police station, Calvin was put in a holding cell to think about his behavior and prepare for a clean confession. But Calvin had nothing to confess, and on the other hand, he couldn't prove that he wasn't Clifford Williams either. There were already a couple of prisoners in the cell, and Calvin's appearance caused noticeable irritation. Of course, they took him for a rich guy who'd been caught with some petty cash and was now waiting for his lawyer and daddy to get him out. "So, brother, tell me what you're in for. I guess you hit something with your car again," one of the prisoners asked. Calvin shook his head confusedly, then looked hopefully at the other cellmate, who looked a little older and was apparently in charge of the pair. "You're looking at me like that? Am I wrong? You're used to throwing money left and right. But all things must come to an end," the man replied and stared at Calvin with a smirk. Meanwhile, Mrs. Beatrice and Mr. Frederick Morris were sitting in the investigator's office, giving a detailed statement regarding their late daughter's discovered bank card. Captain Andrew Brown listened to the visitors in silence, only occasionally asking leading questions that might help him assess the whole situation. "You say Amanda Morris was killed in a car accident a month ago." I've heard. I think the car was found burnt out in a ravine. Isn't that right?" "Yes, that's right, comrade Captain," Mrs. Beatrice said obligingly and dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "Well, that's understandable. But a chap's having a card doesn't prove anything yet. Here are the facts that this detainee was exactly who you're talking about. Do you have photos and a social media account?" the policeman asked again. Mr. Frederick turned pale and shifted his gaze to his spouse. "You see, it just so happens that we don't have any pictures of her fiancé. Amanda talked about him all the time. So what? Gave her a car, a suit. Then something else. Surely that must be him," Mrs. Beatrice muttered. Andrew Brown hesitated for a moment. Despite its seeming obviousness, the event seemed strange. Some strange bloke invites his dead fiancé's parents to a restaurant to pay in front of their eyes with a bank card stolen from their own daughter. Such things happen only in cheap tabloid novels, but not in life, thought the captain to himself. But of course, he did not say it aloud and carefully wrote down the parents' testimony. Having finished the conversation, he gently pointed the spouses to the door and himself decided to visit the detainee, who, of course, on all documents passed as Clifford Williams. But as soon as the captain opened the cell door, a sad sight appeared before his eyes. Calvin was lying on the floor with a broken head and no sign of life. The cellmates, on the other hand, stood a little further back and stared boredly at the ceiling. "What happened here? Scoundrels, what have you done to him?" resented the captain. The prisoners merely spread their hands and said that the detainee suddenly fell down and began to beat in convulsions. "He must be epileptic," Commander muttered one of the cons. But Andrew Brown had already realized that a lynching had taken place. Calling the escorts, he ordered the prisoners to be taken to different cells and an ambulance to be called immediately. Of course, under certain conditions, the young vagrant would have put up a decent resistance to the two prisoners. But since they acted stealthily and hit the guy from behind, he didn't stand a chance. Fortunately, the ambulance crew arrived 5 minutes later, and a young paramedic with a suitcase was already rushing towards the detention cell. When he saw the boy lying on the floor, the paramedic suddenly gasped and clutched his head. "Calvin Wilson. Oh, I'd heard he'd gone down and started vagabonding and living on the streets, but I never thought he'd got to this extent." Captain Andrew Brown turned pale. "What are you saying? Do you know him?" "Actually, it's Clifford Williams." The ambulance paramedic smiled and began treating the wound on Calvin's head. "No, it's not Clifford at all. It's Calvin. He and I played on the same football team in high school. Don't I recognize him? I saw him here the other day. He's a part-timer at the market, carrying fruit and vegetables back and forth. I've always been good to him. We said hello, had a chat. I gave him some money. His parents died. His aunt and her flatmate took the flat, so he ended up on the street." Andrew looked at the paramedic with regret. "Are you sure about this? Can you confirm it for the record?" The paramedic nodded agreeably, then added, "Sure, what are we talking about? Even in front of the judge himself. There's no threat to his life right now. But I'd recommend he stay in the hospital, since he's probably got a moderate concussion." The captain waved his hand in frustration, then called his escort to him and told him to transfer Kelvin to the regular city hospital immediately. Already at the door, he added, "Alert the nursing staff." "All right, but keep an eye on them. We'll put a guard on him, of course, just in case. What if he runs out the window? Or somewhere else? He must be a quick guy. Yesterday he was a vagrant, and today he's a businessman with someone else's stolen bank card. In general, the boy lives a busy life." So, with the easy hand of a former classmate, now a doctor, Kelvin found himself in the trauma department of the city hospital. When he came to himself, he did not immediately realize where he was, as he was literally pressed from all sides by blinding whiteness. There were nurses, orderlies bustling around, as well as a doctor who had time to examine him and give his verdict. "You have a concussion, young man. A thing not fatal, but unpleasant. So I recommend you rest in bed rest. Also, lest you be tempted, there is a guard outside the door who is assigned to you to make sure you don't run away." It made sense there. Calvin nodded in agreement. Talking was painful, as was looking at the bright lamp above his head, and while he tried desperately to regain consciousness, Captain Andrew was fiddling with his forged passport, made by some folk artisan. "You've been set up, kid. And a good one at that. And so it is with this card in particular. I wonder why and who needed it. Was it to put you in jail? But why? The girl was killed in a car accident by accident. Brakes failed. No one was at fault, and she was driving herself. So what's this all about?" the policeman thought to himself. There were more and more mysteries and still no answers. Lying with a broken head on the hospital bed, Kelvin mentally berated himself that he had got into this adventure because of his own greed. "And I bought it, you fool, on a bogus promise. What am I going to do now? They'll probably put me in jail like a criminal, but I've done nothing wrong. And Clifford's good too. I'm sure he's the one who stole the bank card, but there's no one else." Realizing his powerlessness and hopelessness, Calvin began to grit his teeth. At that moment, an orderly passed by and quietly asked, "Look, are you feeling ill? Should I call a doctor?" "No, there's no need," Calvin replied. "What doctor? It's a trifling wound, like they said, concussion." The girl smiled sweetly. "And I'm happy for you, I really am. You know, I have my first day on the job today. You could say it's my internship. So I'm very worried about whether I'm doing everything right or maybe something wrong." Calvin smiled back. "Well, I don't know about the duties of an orderly, but as a person you're doing everything right. You've even lifted my spirits already. My name is Sharon," she added quietly. "And I'm Calvin," the patient whispered. They chatted some more, after which the nurse went to take the laundry to the neighboring block on behalf of the charge nurse. She did not know that the senior had done so deliberately. For exactly 5 minutes ago, she had been strongly advised by Mrs. Beatrice that she should keep an eye on Calvin. And why would I want to do that? No, well, you and I have known each other for a long time, of course, and you can always count on me. But this tramp in disguise, what do you want him for? Very important. All right, I'll keep an eye on him, and I'll write the conversation down on a piece of paper in case of anything. But mind you, don't make a spy out of me. Okay, I'll write it down. I'll pass on the important stuff, but don't count on anything else. I don't want to lose my job either. Annie's older sister cut the call off. She found her old friend's request rather strange. On the other hand, she could not refuse, for Mrs. Beatrice had recently repaid her loan at the bank, which had been an invaluable favor. It was no accident, however, that she had done so, for a long time Annie had been helping the Morris couple with all sorts of medical documentation and certificates. The head nurse did not even think about why the couple could not do it all themselves and ask for her help. This was especially true when it came to taking analyses and all kinds of blood samples. For some inexplicable reason, Beatrice kept asking Annie to fake test results that her blood sugar levels were excessive, when in fact it wasn't. So Mrs. Beatrice never had diabetes. Annie herself was at a loss as to why her friend would go to such trouble. In the end, the head nurse decided that it was all some kind of entrepreneurial trickery that people with money had to resort to in order to get these kinds of tests. Annie contacted the right people at the lab and got it done without a problem. In fact, there was nothing wrong with it, because having diabetes in itself does not make a person exceptional and does not require benefits. Disability is another matter. It is a completely different level of responsibility. Here there is special control, and there can be no mistakes, and ordinary blood tests. The result is more important to the patient than to the nursing staff. That's what Annie thought as she helped Mrs. Beatrice forge the necessary certificates. From time to time, she looked into the room at Calvin, who lay silent and thought about his own thoughts. The boy could hardly know that all this time the head nurse was watching his every movement for some unknown reason. Calvin found himself in the epicenter of events that surrounded him in such a rhythm that he was dizzy. Captain Andrew, on the other hand, did not feel dizzy. On the contrary, he was gripped by excitement, akin to that of a hunter. But now the hunt was not for a beast, but for a man, or rather a group of people suspected of committing a crime. And on top of all this, it suddenly struck the policeman as strange that the Morris couple, Mrs. Beatrice and Mr. Frederick, had not seen their daughter's parents. Not only that, but they'd just agreed to go out with him practically blind. Why would they do that? Especially since it's been almost a month since their daughter died. That's when Andrew decided to take a closer look at the Morris family to understand them. To begin with, he studied their biography and found a lot of white spots in it. Morris moved from another city, located a few hundred kilometers from here. They came and immediately started a flurry of activity, organizing a firm selling building materials. At the same time, they already had a young daughter, who was only a year old at the time of the move. That was Amanda, who died a month ago. Although the car crash itself looked a little strange, as the car had been burnt to the ground and it was difficult to identify the deceased from articles of clothing, the Morrises readily accepted the theory of brake failure and accepted it as the main one. Andrew knew from experience that in such cases parents who have lost a child make every effort to eliminate the possibility of error. And here they acted, as if it had been ordained from above. After some thought, Andrew decided to talk to a neighbor of the Morris family who had lived with them side by side for over 20 years. This is where the captain was in for another surprise from the elderly Mrs. Vanessa. Inviting the policeman to her house for tea, she said of the Morrises with a sly squint. Yes, they've always been mean to people, secretive. I've only seen them 10 times in my life. They never go out in the yard. They always stay in the house or in their car. They're true wolves, I'll tell you that. They have a good daughter, though. Amanda as a child often came to me through a hole in the fence and played with me in the yard. They got along very well. But Mr. Frederick and Mrs. Beatrice always scolded her and punished her for it. They wouldn't let her go out in the yard. I don't know what I did to them to make them so afraid of me. But it's not just me they're afraid of. It's all the strangers and visitors they never invite. Andrew shook his head. But that's not the worst thing in life, you know. All people are different. Some are open-minded, open-hearted, and others are reserved, quiet, he said. Mrs. Vanessa suddenly lowered her voice and looked carefully into the policeman's eyes. Different is different. Only with the Morrises, it's not so simple. Do you believe it? Very much afraid of news from other regions, especially when the postman brings a notice or something. Then they don't just tremble with excitement. They're literally paralyzed with fear. The captain thought for a moment. The information told by his neighbor sounded very strange. He himself thought the Morrises were a bit of cranks, but he could not believe that there was anything wrong with them. After talking to the old lady, Andrew returned to the department to make inquiries as to the birthplace of the 4 businessmen, intending to find out how they'd come to be in their neighborhood. To do this, he called his old friend, with whom he had studied at university when they were good friends. But then fate had scattered them to different cities, and now they could only see each other in video sessions or during summer holidays when their schedules coincided. However, it happened quite rarely because the life of an operative could not be called stable and measured. So, after some thought, Andrew called his friend via video link and waited for a reply. Luckily, John was on the spot and got on the case right away. The Morrises, you say? That's odd. I've never heard that surname, John said. So they left a long time ago. About 20 years ago, Andrew objected. How on earth would you know them? Think about it, then tell me. All right, mate, stay tuned. I'll ask the head of the department. He's an experienced bloke. He'll probably know something. Andrew nodded and waited. John was gone for about 10 minutes. During this time, the captain was bored, but in the end, he got a real shock. The fact was that 20 years ago, the Morris couple had been killed in a gang attack organized by a group of unknown assailants. In addition to them, the housekeeper and the janitor were in the house, who together with the little daughter managed to hide in the basement. The criminals did not find them. Subsequently, the daughter Amanda went to an orphanage, from where she was safely taken a few months later. It was not known by whom. However, no one was particularly interested, because if the orphan girl got a new family, it was more than good. Are you sure they're dead? Andrew asked. He felt he needed a clue now more than ever that would lead him to solving the mystery. John grinned. And, sure, mate. Our department head is the kind that remembers every little detail. In addition, he showed me something in the archive. We've got everything in digital format now. It was a big case back then. A lot of money disappeared from accounts, but no one seemed to be looking for it, because those businessmen were a nuisance to a lot of people. And when they were gone from the city, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Not everyone, of course, but those in the foreground for sure. At that moment, Andrew realized that Mrs. Beatrice and Mr. Frederick Morris were not at all who they claimed to be. They are most likely imposters, having embezzled other people's money and child. Did these Morrises have any special markings? Well, perhaps a mole or a scar, the captain asked hopefully. John hesitated, then said, well, I don't know about special features, but Mrs. Beatrice Morris had diabetes. She was also on insulin all the time. Anyway, she had some health problems. Andrew thanked John for his help and said he now owed him a favor. As soon as he had a spare moment, he would come for an overnight fishing trip. Andrew then picked up the office phone and called the emergency response team. When he rushed to the Morris' house with a search, the couple were frantically packing. Where do you think you're going? Andrew asked ironically. To see your daughter. To the deceased in the cemetery for whom you are so solicitous. Mrs. Beatrice's cheeks flushed with anger and unconcealed shame. What do you allow yourself? You and I have not baptized our children. You have no right to poke me. Andrew grinned. I'm not. I'm just saying you're criminals, and you eliminated Amanda's parents. And then you took the little girl out of the orphanage, pretended you were the late Morris couple, moved to another city to start your life over with criminal money. That's it. Or would you like to add anything else? Mr. Frederick turned pale and clenched his hands into fists. How do you know about this? No one knows. How is that even possible? I mean, we all covered our tracks. We had it all covered. The man's lips trembled and sweat beaded on his forehead. It was obvious from the look on his face that he was about to become hysterical. Andrew removed the handcuffs from his belt and snapped them on Mr. Frederick's hands. He might lash out at the police with his fists. What would they do with him then? Half an hour later, the hapless couple were in Captain Andrew's office giving evidence. It was like a nightmare. But after all these years, they were murderers. It seemed so far away now. Olivia and Michael Smith worked for the Morrises at the country house. For about 2 years, the salary suited them just fine. All the more so because they could live in the guest house and eat for free. But the envious couple was not satisfied with this, because all this time they were tormented by a thirst for quick profit. Therefore, when they were approached by competitors of their masters, they gladly agreed to help them eliminate the businessmen, opening the door to criminals. In exchange, they were able to take all the assets of Morris as a reward. This suited the competitors, as the Morrises were so strong that eliminating them was worth even such a large amount of money. Olivia and Michael, on the other hand, took the money with them and decided to live under false identities. They deliberately took little Amanda from the orphanage to create the illusion of a family that not only did not die during the robbery, but also managed to get out of the situation without much loss. It was for this reason that Olivia befriended the head nurse of the ward so that she could use her connections to help fake the tests that supposedly showed she had diabetes. The couple had thought of everything. Except that recently the adopted daughter began to suspect something wrong. The reason for this was a blood test and the disease that Amanda had contracted shortly before her death in a car accident. It was some kind of virus that required blood donations from everyone in our house. And that's when the most interesting thing came to light. The specialists who conducted the analysis told Amanda in complete confidence that her parents were not her relatives. Then the girl lifted the file from the orphanage and learned that she was adopted by strangers. But then what happened? With a squeamish wrinkle, the captain asked. As Mr. Frederick was already becoming hysterical, his wife answered for him. My husband and I damaged the brakes of the car so that it would crash and nobody would know anything. That's how it turned out. The coffin was almost empty, because everything was burned. Then some bloke calls up recently and offers to meet me. He says he's a fiancé and everything. So we came and saw my daughter's card. She had an unlimited card with a lot of money on it. So we called the police because of that greed. I thought it was to teach the kid a lesson, but it turned out to be a trap. Everyone wanted to steal Amanda's card. Andrew listened and couldn't believe this was happening to him right here, right now. How could anyone do such a thing? Could these people really go to any lengths to hide the truth about their parentage? And when Amanda suspected something amiss, tried to eliminate her. "No, you're not human. You're worse than animals." "Inhumans," Andrew hissed and called security. Of course, lying in the hospital, Calvin did not know all this and was lost in speculation as to his hard fate. What's going to happen to him next? Will he go to jail for fraud, or will he be forced to pay a fine, which he also doesn't have a penny to pay? And he also thought bitterly of Clifford, who had cheated him so easily. So when the strange guests appeared in his chamber, Calvin's whole body trembled. The first to enter was Captain Andrew with a sweet smile on his lips. Then Clifford, already familiar to Calvin, who had deceived him and set him up on all fronts, appeared in the chamber. But at the sight of the one who came next, Calvin felt uneasy. The unexpected visitor turned out to be a girl of about 25, sitting in a wheelchair. Her face was not familiar to Calvin, and so he waited patiently for the captain to announce his verdict. "So, Calvin, have you learnt your lesson?" the policeman asked with a smile. The lad nodded and looked expressively into Clifford's eyes. The latter at once hastened to say, "You forgive me, mate. It was all in my head. Actually, I'm not Amanda's boyfriend or even fiancé. I found her wounded about a month ago, took her to my cabin. I'm a part-time gamekeeper there. I've been helping her out. She asked me not to give her away, so I agreed." Clifford hesitated for a moment, and Captain Andrew looked at him expressively. "Go on, tell him the whole story. Don't be tiresome." Clifford nodded obediently to the captain and continued. "I had to play the rich man to ask you to go to the restaurant. You're Amanda's fiancé who wants to see her parents, and I didn't want the people who wanted to kill her to find out about my meeting with her in the woodshed. So that's what happened. The same people saw the bank card and called the police. That's how they got suspicious. Although with a fake passport in my jacket pocket, it was a bit too much. I confess and repent for what I've done." Calvin shook his head and immediately cringed at the intolerable headache. "But why the need for such complications? Couldn't you have done without it? And why didn't you go to the meeting yourself?" At this point, the girl, who was in a wheelchair, allowed herself to participate in the conversation for the first time since the meeting. "I was the one who asked Clifford to use someone else, because if Clifford had stayed late, I would have been left all alone in that forest cabin. I was very much afraid that my imposter parents, on learning that I was alive, would try to eliminate me. I'd noticed as a child that I didn't look anything like them. But then my mum dyed her hair, and the difference was no longer so striking. And I lived and still felt like they were strangers. And now it's all coming out. And it's mostly thanks to you. Please forgive us. For my part, I promise to make up for all the damage we've done to you." Calvin exhaled in relief. "No, I don't need any reparations. That's fine. Just next time, tell the whole truth all at once, not like this, in pieces." After his words, there was a tense pause in the room. The policeman looked at the young people and quietly went out into the corridor, giving them a chance to talk to each other for a while. As it turned out later, the whole time Amanda had been injured, she had been hiding out in the cabin with Clifford, who had been spying on her parents and trying to find a way to bring them out. He sent anonymous letters to the police several times, but the notes, for some strange reason, did not reach their recipients. Then he and Amanda decided on such a risky combination as bringing in a person from the outside. Clifford wasn't really a businessman. The posh subby used to pick Calvin up from the town bath and barbershop had been hired by him. What a combinator, of course. They nearly tore me up in jail there when they found out I was a rich man. But I'm not even a businessman. I'm a vagrant, just hanging around the back alleys, Calvin mused ironically. "I think we'll fix that. Once you recover, your situation will change," Amanda said with a smile. Calvin looked at his guest incredulously. "How will it change? A tramp is forever. It's like a stigma. You know." "No, that's not what I meant to say. When I get through treatment, I'm going to take the parenting business further, or rather, what's left of it. And I could really use reliable people," Amanda replied immediately. Calvin nodded curtly, still not believing that his life could change so dramatically. Soon the guards were removed from his room, and he was able to go out into the corridor like a normal person. He was hardly dizzy anymore, and thanks to Sharon's help, he was feeling much better. Calvin spent hours chatting with the nice nurse about everything in the world, and he didn't even notice how something special, unlike anything he had ever experienced before, was beginning to stir in his soul. Sharon turned out to be a decent worker. Her childhood was spent in a remote village where her mother worked as a milkmaid and her father as a mechanic for a local farmer. During her school years, Sharon felt as if her whole life was planned ahead of her, as her parents knew they would marry her off to Bill, a neighborhood boy. But when Bill was drafted into the army, the first painful crack in Sharon's life appeared. And first of all, it was connected with her fiancé, who during the army service had an affair on the side, corresponded with a girl from another city. Needless to say how painful it was for Sharon when, after demobilization, Bill married another. The abandoned girl did not want to endure the ridicule of her fellow villagers and the reproach of her parents, and then, having packed her things, ran away to the city. From early childhood, Sharon dreamed of entering the medical school, but unfortunately, at the exam she lacked only a few points to pass on the budget. But she was not offended, because she understood perfectly well that in such a case the knowledge must be impeccable. After all, you are a future doctor, which means that you should know any subject related to medicine on the excellent, she said to herself. Still trying to connect her life with this field, Sharon decided to get a job as a nurse in the trauma center, where a vacancy had just opened up. She rented a room and started living on her own. She loved her job, independent of her parents, and if it weren't for the nagging of the head nurse, she could consider herself happy. Calvin listened to Sharon and smiled. At that moment, it was as if a film was playing in front of his eyes, in which this sweet and kind country girl was playing the main role. After being discharged from the hospital, Calvin did not stop his communication with Sharon, began to meet her after work to take her home. But Amanda, as promised, took him to work. Security guard with the prospect of a promotion to shift supervisor. I guess for a guy off the street, this was the chance he'd dreamed of all his life. Calvin didn't miss it, and a year later he got his long-awaited promotion. Amanda, on the other hand, was treated and now walks like a normal person, only occasionally leaning on a miniature stick. After consulting with Calvin, Clifford proposed to Amanda, which delighted not only his chosen one, but also Sharon, who was actively preparing for the wedding because of her pregnancy. Coincidentally, the two young couples decided to tie themselves in marriage on the same day. But the most surprising was that the holiday was held in a restaurant, which Calvin remembered in the smallest detail. After all, this was the place where his transformation from a tramp to a successful businessman had begun, when he had gone on a blind date at Clifford's request. However, now Calvin had a good understanding of restaurant cuisine and was not afraid that anything could interfere with his family happiness with Sharon. And of course, the guest of honor at the double wedding was Captain Andrew. Not having met his wife from the maternity hospital, the husband went to his mistress. And 5 years later, Barbara was walking home from the antenatal clinic. But no, walking is the wrong word. She was hopping, then suddenly quickening her step, then stopping on the run. The young woman was happy and kept replaying in her head the words of the pretty doctor. Are you going to have a baby? Are we going to register? Or do you have other plans after such a provocative question? Barbara almost angrily retorted. Did you really think I would want to terminate the pregnancy? The doctor smiled. Why were you so shocked? You're young, you're beautiful. According to the examination, you're perfectly healthy. Now girls like you, trying to make a career, make their way to the top, and strengthen themselves on the material Olympus. Only then, in their 30s, do they think of procreation. You're only 21. Things happen. You and your husband are still students, I take it? The woman's doctor was right on the money. She and Calvin were still in their 4th year of university. He's a lawyer-to-be. She's a philologist. But their flat is not a rented one, but a real one, their own. They live in 2 cozy, spacious rooms. It was the parents on both sides of the family who had splurged on the apartment as a wedding present. Barbara lit up with pleasure, imagining Calvin's delight at her news of the addition to the family. They'd been married for 3 years, but things had somehow never worked out before with a baby. She'd even dragged her husband to a consultation at an expensive private clinic, where they'd been examined from top to toe. The summary was pleasing. Both are practically healthy. No physiological incompatibility is observed. Be patient for a year to 3 years if you are not specifically using protection. Lack of conception is considered normal, they were told at the clinic. Barbara smiled slyly at the time. Any hint of contraceptive use was immediately put to rest, she told Calvin. It's too early, you say, and you would like to buy nappies and a nappy at about 40 years old. Maybe it's too early for us to have a close relationship if you are not yet morally ready to take responsibility for the child. When you're mentally ready, I'll keep you warm. Calvin agreed with her reasoning pretty quickly. And who among men would like all these restrictions and obstacles? It's just boredom and zero fun. The subject was once and for all closed. Except that once a month, Barbara's mood briefly soured. Her body signaled that she was, alas, not pregnant again. In the years of reckless youth, such disappointments passed quickly. Calvin would drag her out to a nightclub, to the cinema, or to her favorite pastry shop. Then they'd sit side by side, cramming notes, each on a different subject, serious ones. Calvin liked to quiz her on the U.S. Penal Code, testing his memory at the same time. Nonsense's wife judged through gritted teeth with a disapproving look. I can't get those laws mixed up. I know the criminal code almost by heart, unlike you. So who are you giving a stern look to? Honey used to look tough when he was a lawyer. The world of crime is not a family life. Spell it with an I. They usually ended with a passionate reconciliation in each other's arms. Barbara dreamed again. Maybe it's happened, and she's already pregnant. Barbara came from a large family, adored all 4 of her sisters. She couldn't imagine life without children's voices and the noise of the house. The Smith family in a town near Los Angeles knew everyone. No kidding, they were proud of them. Olivia was too bright for a small town. How did her parents come to name this red-headed, freckle-faced beauty? She was always either pregnant or nursing. The girl gave birth one after another. All the daughters were completely similar to the handsome father, who could play in the cinema some English lord. Call him Christian, as his parents called him, the townspeople refused flatly. He was called simply Chris since he settled with his wife in this favorable town. The story of their young family from the first moment aroused the burning interest of the neighbors, the descendants of old-school immigrants. Their ancestors had migrated to the United States with the Germans under the great leaders of the country, when German colonists were drawn to the lands between the great rivers. Croats, Englishmen, Poles, Serbs, Bulgarians were occasionally found among them. A mixture of blood, a mixture of nations. The descendants have almost no authentic features left from those ancient times, except that they still gave their children unusual names by American standards. And so it turned out that in a shady town drowning in orchards, settled permanently Christian and Olivia. The tradition of giving their children rare names was probably the only thing that this family kept sacredly unchanged. They named their first daughter Amanda. Then came Bridget, Florence, Barbara, and the last baby Emma. Chris and Olivia, as they were persistently called in the town, were considered hard-working and good-natured people. They loved their girls and the land, which gave them rich crops for their careful care. And everything would have been fine and quiet. Only fate had decreed otherwise. On little Emma, it seemed, the laboring woman's strength had run out. God was no longer going to grant Olivia any new heirs. Moreover, already at an early age it became clear that the tiny Emma is not all well with health. The disease was selective. Emma had no difficulty swallowing water or food. She didn't have any seizures that frightened others. She was barely behind her peers in speech, hearing, and vision. Her fate was weak muscles that did not allow her to move freely according to the inexhaustible childlike energy. The little girl's body seemed to be in some terrible spasm all the time. It was both frightening and painful to watch. Olivia, who had always worked in the garden, had suddenly grown quiet. She stopped wearing brightly colored sundresses, smiling at neighbors when they met, chatting to women in the queue at the shop. When there is real grief in someone's home, people secretly try to avoid people so that the negativity is not transmitted. Christian and Olivia marveled at this sudden isolation at first, but then they accepted it. God is the judge of these hard hearts. Mary, the elderly neighbor, who had been through a lot herself, did not separate her parents from themselves. On the contrary, Mary kept telling Olivia, "Come to the witch Dr. Betty, who lives 20 kilometers from us. Maybe she can tell you something. What to do with your baby." After listening to her recommendations, Christian and Olivia decided to do the experiment, put little Emma in the back seat of their car, and went to the address. Betty asked no unnecessary questions. Whispering with her lips, she crossed the girl and gave her verdict. "Don't shed your tears for nothing. Your child is sunny, kind, affectionate. She will continue her strange movements with the support of her arms and legs. But she will warm people's hearts all her short life. Soon she will begin to do her chores. She will have no equal in affection and warm power in your town. Everyone will want to touch the magic girl to warm her soul." And then Betty quickly ushered them out the door with the girl. Christian and Olivia drove home in silence, and then the woman seemed to burst into tears. "My dear husband, you have always been with me in sorrow and in joy. I'm sure that you will be with me through this journey to the end. In the meantime, let's bring laughter, joy, and smiles back into our home. Let's raise all of our daughters in love and harmony." Christian and Olivia kept their word. They returned home revitalized. Happy streams flowed down their arms. The trees had already bent their branches, laden with large, fist-sized apples. In the vegetable garden, the unharvested potatoes were waiting for their time. Bright orange carrots nodded with lacy green. The ripe beetroots, grain to grain, fruit to fruit, what went into the cellar, what would go to the market. Barbara's parents had set themselves the goal of raising their daughters to be educated and honorable people, and they were stubbornly pursuing their dream without turning back. Barbara had already pressed the doorbell when the mobile phone rang in her purse. When she heard her husband's voice in the receiver, she immediately made her voice as mysterious as possible and whispered, "Calvin, I have a terrific surprise for you. You're going to have a sumptuous celebration dinner tonight," Wendy said. And the good news she wanted to tell. She needed something else nice to put her lover in a romantic mood beforehand. But Calvin said that he was busy, running to the skating rink, but by the appointed time will be sure. On the kitchen tiles on the floor, the mum-to-be glides like a waltz. Chicken with round potatoes around it into the oven. Red fish, which she loved immensely, into the frying pan. Now she will still put together a salad of fresh cucumbers, tomatoes with herbs and garlic, and the holiday dinner will be ready. For Calvin, a bottle of wine. For herself, a fan of a healthy lifestyle, sweet carbonated drinks. No, I'm gonna have to cut out the sugary drinks for now. Their baby didn't need that bubblegum chemistry. Barbara looked round the table once more, took out the brightly colored paper napkins she'd been saving for special occasions, set out the plates from the old porcelain set with gold ornaments. She stacked the massive forks and knives next to them. She had never been able to like all that fancy modern crockery, thin and clinking, made like twins, where similar sets were indistinguishable from each other. For dessert, there was good old Praga cake, which she had adored since childhood. Maybe she remembered it so well because their first family trip to the big city ended with a visit to a bakery, where everyone was bought a large sliced cake Prague, generously poured with chocolate icing. Since then, it had stuck in her memory that where that cake was, there was the happiness of serenity. Barbara twirled around the wardrobe, choosing an outfit for dinner. She wanted to impress her husband's imagination with the news of her pregnancy and her appearance. She was sure that in the aggregate everything would look like fireworks, would strike Calvin to the core, would touch his tender, loving heart. Her spouse did not deceive her expectations. At the appointed time, she heard the keys rattle in the keyhole and hurried to meet her soulmate. "Betty, you look fantastic," Calvin announced to her from the doorstep. "What kind of holiday are we having today?" "What are you all dressed up for?" Calvin asked. "Don't rush, darling, change first. Here are your house slippers." Calvin gradually changed, washed his hands, and went to the table. He thought to himself with annoyance, "I should have at least bought some flowers on the way." Was it for nothing that he had recently started working part-time in a reputable law firm? Now he always had some money. It was not all to ask his parents for pocket money. Of course they won't refuse, they don't count every penny. But independence is better than material dependence. Barbara put the salad on plates, took out a ruddy chicken from the oven, shyly glistening with its fried sides and a halo of golden potatoes. She made up her mind and blurted out, "My darling, I'm so happy. We're going to have a baby." Calvin immediately turned pale, and then his face turned red. He almost choked on his wine, and then asked fearfully, angrily and sharply, "Are you sure? Have you been to the doctor?" Barbara looked up at him in surprise and thought for the first time that she didn't appear to know this man or his reactions well. It's a shock. Calvin, meanwhile, came to his senses and unleashed a harsh, implacable monologue. "You've had enough. All the adventures you wanted. Pram, cot, porridge, sleepless nights. Have you thought about me? Am I ready to be a dad at 22? I told you to see a doctor and get yourself some reliable birth control. I don't need all this baby stuff here. If you're old enough, go and get an abortion." The young woman couldn't believe her ears. Her husband was saying all these words. Her always courteous, so gentle and attentive Calvin, with whom they had walked side by side until the leather wedding. As recently as 2 months ago, they celebrated their 3rd wedding anniversary. "Do whatever you want. I don't want this baby," he said flatly. "I hate to tell you, but I'm a big believer in the child-free movement. Do you remember the word child-free? That's my credo. If you get rid of that baby, then we'll talk, Calvin said flatly. In the meantime, I'm going outside to get some air. Your fancy news makes me feel a little sick. Barbara threw her things into her bag, shedding bitter tears. A thought ran through her mind. That's not my Calvin. It's like he's got a demon in him, making him say all those horrible words. I'll go to my parents for a while, come to my senses, share the good news with them, and he'll cool down and change his mind, she decided. Otherwise, how can I live with such a weight on my heart? I don't even want to think about what would happen if all this wasn't an accident, but a sudden collapse of my family happiness and my whole life. Calvin sat at the bar in a cozy drinking establishment and couldn't understand how he had found himself here. The subdued light streaming from the beautiful orange fixtures created a stunning, soulful atmosphere. None of the visitors made any noise, nor did they stand out in the general chorus of voices. There was a group of pretty girls sitting right next to Calvin, celebrating something in a small circle of women. Even they, who were clearly already tipsy, were having a lively conversation without attracting too much attention from the men. 200 grams of cognac, Calvin said to the bartender. And a slice of lemon without sugar, please. He drank the amber liquid in one gulp, as if intoxicated. Immediately he ordered another drink. He felt warm inside. He felt that his tongue could hardly move in his mouth. But he was suddenly so anxious to complain to someone that he started talking to the bartender. You see, Brother, Barbara and I have always been different. I've never been attracted to any girl before her. Just flings. And she's beautiful, hair black as pitch, eyes gray-green, penetrating as if she was looking through me. A luscious figure. The tipsy Calvin gathered his strength and continued his confession. One thing about her, I never understood what is the passion for these little creatures, always disturbing parents to live peacefully. What nonsense. Calvin was indignant. I want a child and she's driving me crazy with her dreams. At least God was merciful and didn't give us offspring for 3 years. And then I come home today and there's a festive table, wine, my wife all dressed up, eyes shining. I could have expected anything, but not such a sudden surprise from her. She's pregnant, you see. Did she ask me before baffling me with such a freeloader? A ringing silence hung over the table where the pretty girls were sitting with cocktails in their hands. All the girls at the hen party could hear every word Calvin said, and they began to whisper, wondering to whom of those present such words about children were addressed. Only to those who were careless and had no desire to procreate. And he himself would like to live carefree and carefree. The young ladies laughed at first, but then began to go home at once. The mood was ruined. Only May looked back at the impolite young man at the door. Handsome, you could make a film as a hero lover. He's a fool when he's drunk, she thought, and opened the front door sharply, catching up with her friends. The time was late. Barbara was sitting at the suburban railway station, where the last train was about to arrive. She hadn't seen Calvin come home drunk and hadn't even noticed the absence of her suitcase. Her husband collapsed on the bed and fell into a heavy sleep, not feeling guilty about the quarrel. Barbara called her father, who certainly wouldn't be surprised by her late arrival. Something had happened, then. Christian listened to her confused speech in silence, then answered meekly. I'll be waiting for you at the railway station, daughter. Be careful on the road. And I'll tell Mom that you missed us unexpectedly. Olivia listened outwardly calmly to her husband's news of Barbara's unexpected arrival, and did not let on that the news had caused her any serious concern. Closing the gate behind her husband's car, Olivia went round to see who was still under her parents' wing. Amanda and Bridget had been living with their husbands and children in different cities for years, wherever fate had thrown them. For them, Olivia was completely at ease. Just today, she'd been chatting to both of them on her mobile phone. 19-year-old Emma was tossing and turning in her sleep, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Florence was quiet and serene in the realm of Morpheus. In her 23 years, she was a sturdy girl with nerves of iron, the first helper in the house and garden for the not-so-vigorous and young Christian and Olivia. The woman lovingly stroked her youngest daughter's shoulder, smiling. My sunshine. Anna. There were no frowning clouds of unhappiness around the boy's neck among all the household. Their trip to Betty's witch doctor had a magical effect on the villagers. Before, they had all tried to pass them quickly. Suddenly Olivia, or Christian, would stop them in the street and say, "I brought some goat's milk for Emma, but I've got enough. Where is it going? And you have a special girl, God bless her." At other times, someone would sneak in a bowl of strawberries, a bucket of May honey, or apricots under the wicket. If Olivia was carrying a girl in a wheelchair, no one would turn aside from their path. Then one day an unforeseen event happened. 2 yards away from the Christian family home lived another family with many children. They knew no grief, only there were boys growing up one after another. Their mother, Agnes, worked on a farm. Their father was a trucker. He drove cargo all over the vast country. No one could say how it happened that they went off and climbed up to the barn. After work, grandmother looked after them in the farm, but that time she lost sight of them. They managed to climb up to the high roof without any obstacles. But how to climb back down? They didn't think about it at the age of 3 or 5. Nothing sensible went into their heads. Jump down onto the straw, suggested the eldest of them. To his misfortune, the little one jumped down, and he fell unluckily on his back, breaking his still fragile spine. Agnes, who had come from the cows at the cries of the neighbors, picked the boy up and dragged him to the infirmary. But it was impossible to touch him with such an injury without qualified medical assistance on the spot. The young body eventually fused the broken bones in the wrong way. The boy remained somehow bent, and when he grew up a little, his legs stopped obeying for good. He was taken to the regional clinic, and the doctors there consulted with foreign doctors. The verdict was the same: it was impossible to help the boy. Now he would have to live like that until he was old. Agnes, in her 35 years, turned into an old woman in a flasher, and her husband's temples were thickly grayed. She would look at her son, sigh in silence, and then she would be off again. There was a sepulchral silence in the house. Not a laugh from the younger boys, not a groan from the most crippled child. It was as if everything had died out. And then one day Agnes came to Olivia's house to get a pair of scissors to trim the excess branches on the trees. And in the house, Emma was just sitting by the window with a book. She raised her bottomless brown eyes to Agnes and held out her hands to her. Agnes was surprised the girl came up, took her hand, and remained silent. And Agnes felt a warmth flowing through her veins and veins. Believe it or not, a heavy stone had fallen from the shoulders of the blameless mother. She looked at Emma carefully, thinking that this girl was not destined for a happy life either. And how kind and warm her face glowed. At home, Agnes immediately started cleaning, baked cakes, and read stories to the boys. She bathed the eldest, changed his clothes, and put him on a high bed with a mountain of pillows under his head. Now she had other thoughts in her head. Fate is hard on us. But my boy is alive and with me by my side. Time will tell how long we both have to live like this. But I will try to make him learn everything that his maimed body will allow him to do. Get the sadness out of the house. You will not break us, but the miraculous warmth, which can heal the soul and guide those on a positive path who do not see a way out of a difficult situation. The news soon spread throughout the village. Some ironically dismissed it, others decided to test her gift for themselves. Moreover, one gossip girl claimed that the girl was a sorceress, bringing her out into the open. And it turned out to be the other way round. When Emma stretched out her hands, which could give warmth and comfort, the woman was like an electric shock. And the girl's arms and legs began to twitch so violently that Olivia, who was sitting nearby, was frightened. "Little witch," shrieked Agnes, the experimenter. "You electrocuted me, you charlatan." Emma didn't say anything back. Olivia, on the other hand, was not confused. "That's how I knew I shouldn't have let you in the house." Her neighbor, how many people go to her house? It's never happened before. Her daughter, who had already arrived, stopped her. "Mum, don't. Everything is fine." The girl had never mastered long sentences, but it was always possible to understand her speech. Emma smiled briefly and took another look at the woman who had come for her warmth and added, "She won't come again." It was impossible to conceal any incident in a small village. The villagers believed even more now that Emma was a child with an extraordinary gift for soothing the heart and soul. Since then, her abilities have never been abused unnecessarily. And when they did, they always wanted to be near the sunny girl and soak up her positive energy. Olivia was distracted by the sound of a car pulling up to the house. and hurried to meet Barbara and her husband on the doorstep. "Barbara, honey, it's so good to see you. Your eyes are tearful. Is something wrong, daughter?" The woman quickly put the kettle on the cooker, took out from the shelf strawberry jam, vases with biscuits. By the way, why ask about something excited from the doorstep? Maybe their conversation won't be for men's ears. After getting everyone drunk on tea and sweets, Olivia sat down on the edge of the bed next to Emma. "Shall we talk about the good stuff or leave it till morning? The morning is wiser," she asked. Barbara stretched happily under the warm cotton duvet, took her mother's hand, and whispered, "I'll tell you all the details. Tomorrow, Mummy. I'll tell you the main thing: I'm having a baby. I am ready to go through any trials to make this baby come into the world." She said the last words almost through sleep, having time to think. "I'm home. It's so nice here." Olivia smiled understandingly back at her daughter, but she couldn't see anything else. "Here's another one of my blood, soon to be a mum herself. Life flows like a full-flowing river, past steep banks, past flowering meadows, past joys and troubles. One generation succeeds another. No one can stop these laws of being." May had been stirring the sugar in her coffee cup for 10 minutes now, monotonously passing the teaspoon round and round, not even noticing that the flavored drink had long since cooled down. She couldn't get that man in the bar and his words about not accepting children in the family out of her mind, and was ready to announce it to the world. All the way back home, her girlfriends kept telling her he was wrong. Without a baby, a family will always be incomplete. Aren't infertile women the only ones who go out of their way to become mothers? May didn't share their enthusiasm. She liked to take a long look at herself in the mirror in the morning. When all the household had gone to work, she admired her perfect body without a single external flaw. And who needs this huge, ugly belly, turning a woman into a scarecrow, she thought. I could so easily have done without all this torment and ordeal. And who decided that motherhood is a woman's lot on this earth? Nonsense and nonsense. I may see my destiny in being the mate, or better still the wife, of a handsome man like the one I saw in the bar last night. To share his views. To live a life of pleasure together, just for ourselves, the ones we love. What's not a splendid plan for the rest of your life, May said aloud. She had not, of course, announced such a manifesto to the girls yesterday. These friends are already dreaming of a full family with all the consequences that entails. I wonder if that man is a regular visitor to their favorite bar, or was he there by chance? I should go there more often in case our paths cross again, she pondered. After a cold coffee and a piece of cake, May hurried to the university. Her diploma defense was in a few months' time, and her thesis report had nothing in it yet. She was going to get an earful from her supervisor. At 7, Calvin was awakened by the insistent melody of his favorite song. The lead singer of the band, with a strained, squeaky voice, right next to his ear, kept repeating, "You hate." God, he thought, waking up with a hangover, I wish I hadn't learnt German at school and university. The obvious translation wouldn't have got on my nerves then. The song was his favorite track. That's why he put it on his phone to his mum's call, as he lovingly called the woman who brought him into the world. Calvin had a surprisingly warm relationship with his mother. If his father once chased him for negligence in studies and laziness in sports, sending the boy to the section almost from the age of 5, his mother always took pity on him and fulfilled any whim. He simply could not answer her call. "Honey, what's wrong?" Mum asked him right off the bat. "You both haven't picked up the phone since last night. Did you go out with your mates on a weekday? Or are you so busy with your books that your ears are filled with knowledge like cotton wool?" Calvin tried to reconstruct in his head the events of last night, starting with his arrival home. He walked through the rooms, looked in the kitchen. Barbara was nowhere to be found. It was clear that his wife hadn't been home last night. "Mum, I'll call you back," he said sharply into the phone. "I can't talk now. There's something I need to find out." In a few minutes, Calvin knew that together with Barbara, their suitcase, with which they had recently traveled to the sea, had disappeared from the flat. His wife Barbara's personal belongings in the wardrobe had also disappeared. There was no point in even thinking about it. The young woman could only have gone to her parents. Calvin brewed himself a cup of coffee, found last night's dinner in the fridge, ate a cold chicken, and thought about it. Then he dialed his mother's number and went on the offensive. Can you imagine? My wife is going to have a baby. How does it happen in this position? And asked interestedly. Did she fly in, or what? Was surprised by the potential grandmother on the other end of the line. Can you imagine? Calvin replied. It was an idiot's dream come true to have a screaming baby at my disposal. How can you be so rude? The woman raised her voice slightly. Son, in a normal family, a baby is a normal thing. A natural result of a man and a woman living together. But you, mother, don't start lecturing me now, he interrupted. I've already expressed my position on the matter. I offered her to terminate the pregnancy. But she's stubborn. She packed her bags and went to her parents in the suburbs. What am I supposed to do? Get on my knees? Talk her into coming home? His impassioned speech had no effect. His mother's response was merciless. You're going to clean yourself up right now. I can hear in your voice that you were pretty drunk last night. You're going to Barbara's parents, and you're bringing your pregnant wife home. Your father and I have always indulged your little foibles. We've spared you no expense, no effort. But I don't want my son to be a scoundrel, forcing his wife to run away from home when she's pregnant. Mum, but I don't want to become a father at 22, whimpered the misunderstood Calvin. This decision is final and cannot be appealed. His mother cut him off and pressed the disconnect button. Calvin realized that he was not even between hammer and anvil. On the other side of the barricade, where not only his wife but also his parents were the opposing side, he had no doubt that his father would also take his mother's side. With a frustrated sigh, Calvin headed for the shower. There was nothing to be done. He would have to go. He reached Barbara's hometown at about 3 in the morning. The day was slipping towards evening. The orange orb of the sun was slowly going to rest somewhere in the neighboring yards. Dogs barked, alarmed by its footsteps. It was as if the street had died out, though quite a few people had come out to the station with him. It was as if they had all vanished into thin air. There were no other villages nearby. A whole crowd got off the local bus with him. Many people knew him here, especially those who had enjoyed their wedding. They had celebrated it twice, so as not to offend anyone. First in the city, in a restaurant, in the circle of his parents' acquaintances, and then in the village, right in the yard to an old cassette recorder. And then, as usual, an accordion with folk songs. Calvin had never understood this rural tradition of inviting everyone to the table, but Barbara had told him straight away. A girl's wedding is her most important holiday. Even those young ladies who do not make a cult out of it dream of showing off in a white dress in front of many spectators, and I am no exception. Looking over the fence, Calvin noted that all his wife's family was at home. He'd have to confront his wife in front of witnesses. He pushed open the gate and froze. Olivia was looking at him from the window. He realized at once that she already knew about his quarrel with his wife. Yeah, well, there was nothing to do. He squared his shoulders and strode proudly to the porch. No one came out to meet him. He hesitated in the hallway, and then his wife appeared at the door with eyes full of vague hope. Maybe he's changed his mind, he'll apologize to her now, and everything will be as it was before. And then Calvin, instead of repenting, calming his beloved, saying that he had been wrong, had overreacted, froze in his tracks. It was as if demons were playing in him. He suddenly looked angrily at his wife and hissed. I thought about whether you and I need a child. My answer is still no. Barbara turned pale. Her thoughts were dashing feverishly. He's a stranger. He's a complete stranger to me. I'll carry the baby, I'll hide the baby. He will be mine alone. In the room beyond the wall, Christian and Olivia jumped at once at the sight of Emma convulsing in her chair. They were already aware of the scandal in Barbara's family, of course, but they decided to give the young people a chance to talk it over again. They stayed out of it for the time being. Emma was still hysterical, pointing out of the window, sobbing, whispering. It's bad. It's bad. It's bad. Christian jumped out into the yard just as Calvin grinned mockingly, spat contemptuously on the ground through his teeth, and shouted. 1 month I give you, wife, to dispose of this gift. It's either me or the baby. What happened next was like a slow-motion film from a melodrama. The father-in-law grabbed Calvin by the scruff of his jacket, pushed him out the gate, and said angrily, "Don't you ever set foot here again, you lousy puppy. We'll raise our grandson or granddaughter ourselves without such a daddy. Don't you dare set your nose here again. What kind of puppy are you? Dogs are loyal creatures, and you, as I see it, have no idea what loyalty to a loved one is. Get out of here." Calvin stumbled to the bus stop to get to the railway station. It was getting dark. It was likely that the last train into town had already left, but he wasn't thinking about that right now. Trying on the empty platform, he negotiated with a local taxi driver. The good thing about money at his parents' expense was that he was not constrained. In town, Calvin decided to stop by that nice bar to drown his father-in-law's humiliation in brandy degrees. Nothing. He would somehow find common ground with his parents in this matter. They won't give up their only favorite son. Or would they still defend their decision? May did not meet the guy that night and went to a familiar bar alone, without any curious friends. What was her surprise when the young man walked into the bar in even more upset feelings? He went straight to the bar and ordered a large portion of cognac. He drained the glass in a gulp and looked round the room, which was almost empty before closing time. The time was approaching midnight. May didn't waste any time. When else would she get a chance like this? She put on the mask not of a femme fatale, but of a slightly sad girl puzzled by some problems of her own. She slowly approached the bar, smiled at the bartender as if with effort, and said, "I'm not having a good day today. Pour me something stronger, please. It may be unseemly for a lady to drink, but I don't have an ounce of socialite in me right now." Calvin turned round interestedly, thinking, "Someone else's current day has gone wrong. I'm not alone in my sadness," he said aloud. "Let's drink to all the good things together. There are good things." May pretended that she only noticed that she was not alone at the bar. She shook her ashy hair beautifully, opened her blue eyes wide with long, thick, black, skillfully painted lashes. "Come on, young man, where has our life been yet?" Calvin ordered a martini for the lady. For some reason he was too shy to offer her a cognac. They talked about nothing. They had much in common in their preferences for cinema, music, and books. Both of them were quite educated, moderately intelligent, quite advanced people. Even the barman began to look at them with a sidelong glance. The establishment worked according to the system of service to the last visitor, and these two did nothing, completely dissolved in each other. He was already nervously, while they were talking, looking at them with the look of a faithful dog, which it was time to walk. And the glasses had to be polished 10 times over. It was no use. Calvin and May sipped slowly from their glasses. They were talking about something again, and even laughing. The bartender had given up hope of spending the rest of the night in his bed. And then the sweet couple suddenly got up and went somewhere quickly. He only heard the end of their conversation. The man happily said that he was going to order a taxi for the lady. And the lady told him that after such a heart-to-heart conversation she would like to invite him to her place for a cup of coffee. That was quick. How did it work out for them, involuntarily thought the employee of the drinking establishment, locking the door behind the last customers. Why am I surprised, though? How many people come to our bar separately and then leave together? How does Pushkin put it? A cruel age, cruel hearts nowadays, everything is easy and simple. An age soft on morality, hearts easy on disposable love. I'm getting a little philosophical with fatigue. Home, hurry home, and go to bed. And Calvin was tenderly hugging his new acquaintance May by the shoulders in the back seat of some foreign car. He didn't even look at the model of the car out of joy. May's unexpected offer to continue the evening at her house threw him at first into some confusion, then encouraged him. Well, let Bridget be a mum-to-be. Other women are interested in me. Now I'll prove it to her and myself. That night was a vivid revelation to both of them. May, who had already had some experience, had never met such a man. Calvin, to his amazement, realized that intimacy with his wife, which had seemed a miracle to him, was far from sensual perfection. It was just before morning when they both collapsed powerlessly on the pillows. Satisfied with each other, they fell asleep almost simultaneously. Calvin only had time to think. Life's getting better. A couple of hours later, his happy mood was dampened by a call from his mother. Calvin, I'm waiting for news. Are you home from Barbara's yet? My father and I are going to buy some sweets tonight and come over for tea. We'd like to congratulate our daughter-in-law on becoming a mom. It's a very exciting event for every woman. What time do you usually get home? From class. Calvin freed himself from May's embrace, who had fallen serenely asleep on his shoulder. Calvin looked around. His parents absolutely had to know nothing about him waking up in a strange bed with May. He would very much like to continue this wonderful companionship, but introducing her to his parents would be a wild thing to do. "Mum, don't worry," he said into the phone. We had a productive talk with Barbara and her parents. Together we decided that it would be a good idea for her to stay with them a little longer. Autumn is pleasantly warm so far. The orchard is full of wonderful apples. The vitamins and fresh air won't hurt her mum-to-be. And in a week I'll go and pick her up and bring her home. We'll make up for it at university. It won't be a problem. Calvin couldn't even explain to himself why he had taken this time out from his mother. Maybe it would have been better to announce that their marriage to Barbara was over. They would each go their separate ways. But Calvin didn't dare give this information to his mother. This night had been too dreamy, too much to think about. May woke up and stretched sweetly like a contented, satisfied cat. Calvin didn't need to know that her parents had nurtured and cherished her always, like a fragile and delicate flower. Cultivated in her the notion that she was a princess, a girl who should know no worries or troubles. She never knew denial of any of her whims. For 3 years, she had been living in her own flat, which she was given after successfully completing her first year of university. She chose a purely female profession, economist. To be fair, there are also many economists among men, but May in this area imagined the male sex only in the position of chief financial officer, nothing less. And all these high regalia were not important. She wanted a man who was wealthy, handsome and intelligent, to be a colorful addition to him. Calvin seemed to her just such a promising option. She would do her best to find out more about his far-reaching plans for her life. The fact that the man was married, about to become a father, didn't bother May in the least. It was a warm and sunny autumn morning. Outside the window, a magical golden autumn reigned. She and Calvin were about to have coffee and pancakes. Yesterday she ran in and her mother left her daughter a whole container of ruddy, fried scones with cottage cheese, and then outside to walk through the rustling yellow dirty leaves. To breathe the pleasant air, filled with the last scents of autumn flowers still in bloom. To stop by some pastry shop, where they know how to make delicious little cakes with prefabricated cream, her favorite treat. Emma had been hysterical for several hours after Calvin's arrival. It was the first time it had happened. Christian and Olivia no longer knew how to calm their youngest daughter at the grocery shop near their home. Olivia met Agnes later that day. That first heartache patient who had once been so warmed by Emma's touch. The women got to talking. Agnes was very enthusiastic about meeting the young doctor who had traveled from the city to see their disabled son. "He is extraordinary," she said. "This young doctor specializes in the moral rehabilitation of young patients. A psychologist from God, he tries to make their lives more fulfilling, more lively, to adapt them to society." "And what methods does he use?" Olivia was immediately interested. "What do you think, neighbor? Maybe it makes sense to show him our Emma when he comes to visit you next time." "What he does and how he does it, I can't tell you," Agnes replied. "He talks to his charges in private. What I do know is that my son is always enthusiastic after his visits. His eyes shine with joy. He no longer feels so sad about his situation as a sedentary patient. Even on the street on his wheelchair now began to show up without undue strain. And recently Lucy, a young girl whose boyfriend died in the conscription service because of an accident, started to look in our house. She and my son would go to the bench outside the yard and talk about something for hours. Somehow I couldn't resist my curiosity." May listened to what Lucy was saying at the time. "I still can't get her words out of my head," she said to Olivia. "She was right," she said to Olivia. "What did she say?" Olivia couldn't resist asking. "I won't repeat it verbatim, but the general meaning was like this," Agnes explained. "God, I'm glad you're alive. If my beloved had come back from the service wounded and maimed, I would still be with him all the time that heaven has given us." The women were silent, immersed in thought. Only each of them was thinking to herself about her own misfortune. Each knew what her friend in misfortune was thinking now. There is nothing worse than looking at your child and knowing that he is doomed to a different life than the rest of the human race. Unbearable, they thought. Sometimes this hidden inner pain. Accepting it over time is possible. To accept it is hardly possible. Agnes promised Olivia that she would get a sensible doctor to see Emma next Tuesday, and so they parted. They both hurried home to their eternal chores. Agnes was not deceived. She had fulfilled her promise. On Tuesday, a handsome young man in his 30s knocked on Christian and Olivia's door. If the owners had been asked what his first impression was, they would have said with one voice, a good one. David was a pleasant, charming, intelligent doctor. He made it clear right away that he wanted to talk to his mom alone. And the girl herself didn't object in the least. They talked for over an hour. And then David agreed to have dinner with them. It was getting dusk outside the window. It was a good time to get together at a cozy table. David got to talking to Barbara. The woman herself did not realize how she had managed to tell him that she was pregnant and that she wanted the baby very much. But her husband did not approve of her decision to give birth. The doctor looked at her carefully and replied, "Men often come to maturity much later than women. Most think about it when they see the baby. Their paternal heart starts beating more frequently. But there is a certain category of gentlemen to whom children are only a hindrance in life. It's a waste of time to rehabilitate them," David concluded. After a delicious dinner, which David praised, Barbara volunteered to escort him to the bus stop. "I don't mind," said the nice doctor. "It would do you good in your condition. The bus stop isn't far. The lanterns in the village are working properly. Mums to be need fresh air like air." And he laughed at his joke without being embarrassed. "Tautology, Barbara," he explained. He was incredibly easy to be with. There was no need to think about what you wanted to say, no need to choose words, no need to be afraid of sensitive topics that affected her ego. This psychologist had clearly chosen his profession for a reason. Emma had not had a single tantrum during the week. Not once had she stomped her feet or thrown her toys. Barbara had met her soulmate. That was the impression David had left on her. David took the train into town and reminisced. Olivia hadn't misjudged his age. 6 months ago, he had been 30 years old. 15 of those years he'd spent making sure that people with disabilities, and congenital diseases smiled at the new day. Their family was considered a real medical dynasty. At the same time, they were not arrogant in the least. David's grandfather was a renowned geologist. His grandmother worked all her life as a nurse in a neurological dispensary. All 3 sons then followed in their footsteps. The eldest became an oncologist, the middle one a surgeon, the youngest a traumatologist. When the only son David was born in the family of the youngest, no one could think that he would want to become a professional psychologist. He loved her very much, his desk mate, his classmate, his childhood friend Sally. David had grown up to be such a tough kid, tall and broad-shouldered beyond his years. He was angular at first, and then he became stately. He and the new girl were put at the same desk in 5th grade. She was thin, a little pale, and very, in his terms, beautiful. Even a short haircut for a boy did not spoil it, on the contrary, made her huge gray eyes somehow very piercing, bottomless, a little pitiful. After a week, he started bringing bright yellow apples with small freckles for her from home. She loved them very much. Sally came from a broken home. Her mother got a job at school with the girl and worked as a cleaner. David and Sally's classmates tried to make barbs about the girl, but he stopped them so sharply and decisively that no one seriously began to mess with the tall boy. Sally didn't want to go to the costume New Year's Eve ball for the middle schoolers. Her mother didn't have the money for what she called a waste of money. So David brought her home for the first time, and he and her mother made Sally a costume of Maya, the little bee from her favorite cartoon, out of gauze, gold tinsel, and black paper. By the ornate Christmas tree on stage, when the costume contest was held, Sally's big eyes made a sensation. The main prize, for some reason a huge blue teddy bear, almost as big as Sally herself, was immediately handed to her by the head teacher. On the 8th of March, in the 6th form, David's mum bought a real Barbie doll for her son's friend. There was no limit to the envy of the girls in the class, but David and Sally had not been interested in all those envious glances for a long time. They walked to and from school holding hands. David was always the first to go to the cafeteria, and he took 2 glasses of tomato juice and sandwiches with doctor's sausage. After a quick snack, they would run into the classroom to go over the assignment together. Both of them studied only for A's. Sally, petite and wearing a short-sleeved shirt, had become almost a full-fledged member of David's family. After school, they would go straight to his house, where lunch was waiting for them on the cooker. Warming up soup, mashed potatoes, or pilaf, they quickly demolished it all. In good weather, they would go for a little walk in the neighboring park. In cold and inclement weather, they would watch adventure films or fantasy on TV. Their views and taste matched in almost everything they did together. Sally's mom looked past their friendship. The perpetually tired woman had no time to check who her daughter was spending time with and how much time she was spending with them. No problems with her studies, that was fine. A terrible misfortune fell on Sally and David slowly, but rapidly. Once on another winter holiday they went, as usual, to the skating rink. Suddenly a little figure skater, who skates very well, fainted right on the ice screaming with lights. David, who came up to her, somehow immediately realized that the matter was serious. He picked up the bee in his arms and dragged her to the medical center of the entertainment center, where the skating rink was located. A businesslike woman doctor from the ambulance dictated clearly teenage girl, 15 years old, I assume a heart attack. David went to the hospital with Sally. You should have seen the confused state he was in. The crew allowed him to take a reclining seat in the back of the car. On the way he got everyone up on their feet, his grandfather, his father, his mother, his uncle. Half an hour later, everyone who could support David in his time of need had arrived at the hospital's emergency room. The diagnosis was devastating. A gray-haired cardiologist came out to them and announced that the girl had a neglected congenital heart defect. Hadn't any of you doctors ever noticed that she might have had sudden blue lips? Weakness? He asked. David stepped forward. I spend whole days with her. There's never even been a hint that she has a health problem. She's ahead of the curve in PE. She rarely missed a class. She's on par with everyone else in class. What can I tell you, dear colleagues? Answered the cardiologist. The girl seems to have a strong, courageous character. She naturally felt sick, but did not show it. Her ailing heart had weakened, and then there was the slightly delayed age of transition. If she'd had heart surgery as a child, she'd have forgotten about it long ago. We're going to rush her into surgery now, but only a miracle can save her. There was no miracle. Sally's heart stopped. 2 hours later, David's heart stopped right there on the operating table with it. And in the cemetery, among the wreaths of snow-white flowers, David's sturdy figure in a dark jacket seemed from afar like a rock, a monolith frozen by grief. Even those closest to him did not realize what he had put in the coffin for his faithful friend. It was a last gift, a sign of very great love and tenderness. The guy spent the whole day going around all the toy shops until he found a small but very colorful bee Maya in one of them. When the first clods of earth began to fall on the coffin lid, David walked to the edge of the grave and said, I never got round to telling you that I love you. I was afraid you'd laugh, because we were only friends. I promise that I will devote my life to curing the deprived, unaccompanied hearts of longing. In your memory, my love. Without you, my world is empty. David kept his vow to his beloved friend, as they say, bulldozed into his studies after her death. He graduated from school with a silver medal, entered the medical university on a budget without problems. All his free time was spent with scientific literature of the medical field. Already in the 3rd year, I knew quite well the works of Carl Jung, Freud, Karlin, Korley, Zinchenko, Grigorenko, Kuzmina. He absorbed their thoughts and conclusions, judgments, sometimes not remembering to whom they originally belonged. But he absorbed everything in a row, as a sponge absorbs water. The boy was not a monk. He understood perfectly well that to keep himself in austerity is at least stupid. He was successful with his classmates, had brief flings, but no one managed to melt the ice in his heart. At first, such hot attempts in his address, many young ladies still undertook, but soon realized that this always a little gloomy young man is not believed in any female tricks. Why he behaved like that remained a mystery. His sad love story was known only to those closest to him. They were not going to talk about it. Then David had a long practice. He asked for a part-time job in the neurological dispensary. where his grandmother once worked. David assessed the situation soberly. Mentally ill people, and those who survived the tragedy, remaining mentally healthy but lost due to their grief. For society, these are two big differences. The public in the treatment center was diverse. For himself, he singled out a few cases where it seemed to him that mental illness was a natural extension of the immense grief of losing a loved one. Evelyn, 40, had been admitted to a neurological institution after she began wandering around the entryway dressed as a ghost. She could not accept that her beloved husband had been killed in a car crash. He came to her in sweet dreams almost every day, saying that he was near, just lives now in a parallel world. All she has to do is reach out her hand. Evelyn learned her lessons from her nocturnal visits with her husband and made herself a costume of an inhabitant of otherworldly worlds. Wore it when dusk fell. Then she looked for her soulmate outside the house, in the entrance, scaring the neighbors and passers-by. In the daytime, the woman became herself again, lived her usual withdrawn life quietly and peacefully. The respectable people did not approve of such night ghost phenomena. They wrote a report to the district police. Evelyn was taken to the dispensary quickly, and then she finally became despondent. Her husband stopped visiting her at night. She began to think seriously about leaving the world. So she would be more reliable, it seems, with him in that favorable, otherworldly world, and then her husband would be there again. The head doctor was rather skeptical about David's initiative to work with this woman. "Father, you've chosen a difficult case, both quiet and violent at the same time. We keep Evelyn on medication all the time. She sleeps all day long. I can't think of anything wrong with her. But I want to bring her back to a full life," objected the young specialist. "A beautiful woman, she was a businesswoman. But what has she turned into? We must make her happy again with summer sunshine, winter fluffy snow, autumn beauty of fallen-colored leaves, and spring delicate aroma of mimosa sprigs." The old professor smirked and added an admonition only at the end of the dialogue. "Our basic principle is to do no harm. And remember, then act boldly." Evelyn was lying idly on the bed when David appeared in the ward. Her only advantage over many of the other patients was that her younger sister May had arranged for her to have a separate apartment with cozy furnishings, a large television set, and bouquets of fresh flowers in elegant vases. You wouldn't know it was a hospital. It had a homely atmosphere. David had no plan to bring the woman out of her deepest stress. He stared at the pretty patient in silence for a moment, then suddenly decided to sit down and tell her about his personal experience. In the middle of his monologue, Evelyn changed her position and turned round to face him. At the end, she asked him a question in a muffled voice. "And how did you, doctor, manage to cope with the inner emptiness and acute loneliness?" David, without hesitation, said, "I decided to dedicate myself to people who were also in the midst of hopelessness." "I love my dog," Evelyn suddenly said, "but I can't afford to have a friend at home. My business involves constant traveling. I won't be in treatment forever." David had an idea. "You know, Evelyn, my close friend Christian runs a dog shelter with his parents. I'll talk to your doctor today. Maybe he'll let you and I go there together." The woman smiled miserably. "I'll be grateful to you, David, and I promise I won't make any more attempts to collect more pills, to drink them all at once. When you're alone with a big grief, people around you are just as serene. It starts to feel like you've been dealt such a terrible fate. Your story showed me that there is a lot of grief around. It's just that people live in it like a tough shell, not showing the world what hell is going on inside them." A fortnight later, Evelyn was discharged from the dispensary. During this time, they had already made 2 trips with David to the shelter, where the woman couldn't resist taking home a large Labrador puppy. "You know, David," she shared with her handler on the way back, "I've decided to make a radical change in my life. I'm no longer attracted to my cosmetics business. I've already offered to buy out my salon chain to a longtime competitor. I'm sure she won't miss this chance to get her hands on a place that's popular with women. And I got the idea to set up my own kennel. I want to breed pedigree Labradors, to give people the joy of communication with these wonderful dogs." The head doctor of the dispensary congratulated David on his first victory. He added that almost every ward of the medical center needs such a soulful, individual approach. How many destinies, broken lives can be redirected with simple words? What new horizons can a person who believes in himself again reach? He pondered aloud. Then there were many, young and old, who were able to accept grief and move on, and those who were never able to come to terms with the misfortune that had befallen them. David's tactics were always the same. He tried to reliably switch the person to something very important, very interesting, to leave no chance to get off the new path. There were failures in his work, but on the whole, the method worked amazingly well. A mother who lost her son and fell into a deep depression, he arranged to volunteer in an orphanage. A lonely old maid who had long ago lost hope for personal happiness after the death of her mother was assigned as an apprentice to a master in men's haircuts. A year later, she met in the salon with a single father with 2 children. Now she lives happily ever after. That's how David walked through life, helping those suffering to get rid of the oppression of circumstances without looking back. At first, he treated Barbara and Emma with condescension, taking them for just another unattached, but spoilt young ladies who had had a lot of injustice in their lives. Barbara shuddered with fear for a long time, and if someone knocked on the gate, she waited for Calvin's remorse and forgiveness. Then she decided to go to correspondence school. The once burning desire to study classical English literature somehow subsided. Later, David generally convinced her that with such a love for children from her will be an excellent teacher of Russian language and literature. After her maternity leave, he advised her to change her specialization and devote herself to pedagogy. Emma, and Dave, as she called him briefly, was also very fond of him. With his help, she learned to get out of her wheelchair and back into it easily, and to move around the house and garden a little on her own. However, she still preferred her mentor to be somewhere near her. Barbara's belly had already rounded up considerably. She was a couple of months away from giving birth. Winter was over, with all its long, magical holidays. Spring was blooming with the blossoming of fruit trees. The day was getting longer and the nights seemed shorter. David found himself looking forward to Tuesday more and more often. He couldn't wait to see Barbara again. Suddenly, he found himself watching her as she poured his coffee, sliced apples for jam, and did her simple hairdo. This young woman seemed so cozy and homely to him. At times, Barbara would fall silent, as if listening to herself, trying to determine what her long-awaited baby was doing. Then her face would always light up with a smile, and David would avert his eyes in embarrassment, thinking that she looked like Madonna, as innocent and perfect. After a while, the man realized it had happened. He had fallen in love again with Barbara, who was due to give birth in a couple of weeks. He didn't share his feelings. This young woman had already gone through the betrayal of a loved one and was able to overcome it honorably. But David was not sure that in Barbara's soul there was no hope that her husband would come at least to meet her from the maternity hospital to see her son. The ultrasound had long ago revealed that Barbara was having a boy, and she hoped he would mellow out and want to be near his family. Calvin hadn't shown up once in all this time. Only his parents came to visit with an unexpected offer to sell the flat and return the money invested in it to Barbara's parents. The boy would have to be raised, brought up, educated. The mother-in-law considered her decision wise and logical. Barbara herself remained silent during this conversation. David was right, she still hoped in her heart that time could be turned back. Despite the fact that, according to her mother-in-law, Calvin was already living with another woman. She knew her husband well. He'd made a mistake, fallen for some other woman. She's pregnant, not so attractive now. Vain hopes, vain tears in the pillow at night, a woman's loneliness. Calvin lived for his own pleasure, barely remembering his family. Calvin and May initially hid their relationship from the man's parents for a long time. At his request, May pursued with persistence the cherished goal of winding up and marrying Calvin. She sat by his side when he needed to do his studies. Although she was a year older, May successfully defended her degree and got a job as an aspiring economist in a small firm. Calvin passed the session, moved to the final year, became a good employee in a law firm, where he recently got a part-time job. Now he was an assistant lawyer on family cases there on full rights of a staff member. In the law firm, no one guessed that career success clever Calvin was due to a quiet, modest, but clearly talented guy who came to the lawyers to practice. The newcomer had a phenomenal instinct for successful, profitable deals. He did not get involved in the cases himself, but a couple of times hinted to Calvin for which divorce proceedings should be taken up and which litigation companies to join. Having already won twice in complex litigation, Calvin suggested to the chief the best line of behavior. He was going to take his new girlfriend May somewhere in Turkey, Tunisia, or Egypt. Suddenly, he was shocked to hear from his own mum. "Son, I turned a blind eye to your relationship with May. I thought you would come to your senses and think about it. But my hopes were not fulfilled. There's not much time left before our grandson is born. Father and I don't want to be mean and greedy people. I'll give you a week to vacate the flat. We'll sell it. It is decided to give all the money to your wife to support the boy." Looking ahead, we can tell you that Calvin's conscience about welcoming his wife and son from the maternity hospital did not even think of waking up. On the day of the birth of his child, he slept serenely at home. The holidays after the session were in full swing. Then he went to the supermarket to buy a couple of bottles of wine for dinner. That evening, Calvin had his first nervous conversation with May. She was so used to living in a spacious two-bedroom flat that she didn't want to move the two of them into her studio flat. From here, her work was within walking distance. The infrastructure here wasn't the same as near her own flat on the outskirts. Another ultimatum appeared in Calvin's piggy bank. "We've been together for over 6 months, honey. It's time to make a decision. What are your plans for me? If we are to have a real family, not just a cozy pastime, you will take responsibility and provide your woman with both a place to live and means to live. Exactly a trouble-free existence." The man was at first a little taken aback by such a statement, but then he remembered a busy conversation with a talented trainee. In his mind, he instantly conceived a plan to earn a decent sum of money for at least a year of the life to which May was accustomed. He could no longer do without this resourceful person, hot, beautiful companion at all the parties in their youth group, surprisingly even sometimes a good hostess. Calvin had no way of knowing that May's friend's cleaning company did the cleaning in his flat, and that the pickles in the fridge came from orders placed at cafes and restaurants. "There will be a beautiful life for you, and there will be prosperity," Calvin proudly replied to his friend. Inappropriately recalling the children's poem "The Old Man," which his mother liked to read to him before bedtime, Calvin said, "I have a plan. I'm sure it will work." May's gratitude gave Calvin even more confidence that the plan would go well. The next day, he didn't go to work, he ran there. Calvin's plan was simple. Yesterday, stammering, blushing and pale, an intern had told him that a client had made him an indecent proposal. Calvin had thought at first that the customer's outburst was of a different nature, but it turned out to be otherwise. The client offered the guy to steal one of the documents in the case of divorce proceedings with his wife. Deprived of such a strong argument, the woman was losing everything. The proud young employee rejected the offer with indignation, and Calvin decided to take advantage of it. Contacting the unscrupulous mate was easy. All his contacts were on file, as they should be. Calvin set up a meeting with the slippery fellow in a cafe on the other side of town. He did the deed. Then it was over. Inexperienced in such matters, the employee of the law firm did not take into account only one nuance: the wife of the scoundrel was not a bad guy either. She has long ago hired a private investigator who constantly monitored the movements of almost ex-spouse. Further could unfold a fascinating story. The offended woman was like a wildcat. She appeared in front of the spouse at the moment of the exchange. Angered by the perfidy, the wife did not come alone, but with the press, and in the evening stories about the corruption of the lawyer's world were shown on all the local news channels. Calvin's name was instantly blacklisted from all legal services. To get a job in his profession, he could now only somewhere in Zimbabwe, and even then unlikely. Calvin's parents raised all their connections, trying to hush up a criminal case on several articles at once. Calvin was facing serious charges. He didn't get away with it. Given the large size of the reward, the court sentenced him to 2 years' imprisonment in a penal colony with a substantial fine. May, who had unwittingly inspired Calvin's aspirations to get a lot of things at once, vanished from his flat in an instant. Ubiquitous journalists quickly found the girlfriend of the hero of the day, but she refused to comment, muttering a pre-prepared phrase. No comment. Barbara learned about what happened to her husband much later from his parents, who brought money and gifts for their recently born grandson. Named Christian after his grandfather, the baby never learned that his birth father had not wanted him before he was born, and later ended up in prison for dishonest intentions to enrich himself without labor. On the day that little Christian was born, Barbara was driven to the hospital in a car David had recently acquired in an amazing way. The doctor had an almost fantastic story with this car. He lived in average conditions, wrote his PhD thesis, worked extensively with patients in the city and region, but never charged inflated fees for his appointments. Everything according to the price list of the clinic. Once a very old grandmother from a distant village turned to him. Her grandson was a biker and had crashed his motorbike. The old woman could not forgive herself that God had taken him young and left her, the owner of the gorgeous flower beds. The flowers were still growing and blooming, but her own child was gone. It took David more than one session with Granny and the gardener to turn her attention back to the flowers that needed care. The last time he was about to leave for the train, Grandma stopped him. "Son, wait. I have one more thing to do for you. Hold the paper. You read it carefully." David's eyes widened when he saw the contents of the document on letterhead with watermarks. It was a gift deed in his name for a blue BMW car. "Yeah, no," David said, embarrassed by this. David bought it from his grandmother, who and her grandson lived alone in the whole wide world. He's a loner. "I'm an old lady, God's dandelion. His parents died. I brought him up. He is late, they had a child. They all traveled around the world to Elbrus, and in their box traveled. My grandson wasn't poor, he was a businessman. This is his car, just for the parade. He used it. All on this iron friend of his, until it ruined him. You use it, son. I had a neighborhood officer help me with the paperwork. It's all according to the law." And that's how Dr. David got a shiny blue car. After the discharge, Barbara was welcomed by the whole team. Amanda, Bridget, and her family came to the village to celebrate the occasion. Christian, Olivia, and Emma stood with large bouquets of flowers. And David held a cake for the staff and a bundle of colorful inflatable balloons. Barbara froze with a bundle with a baby in her arms and admired him fondly against the clear azure sky. He looked very cute in his new light-colored shirt with the collar open. Suddenly, one of the red balloons, painted with hearts, burst with a deafening sound. Barbara laughed and suddenly realized that she no longer loved her husband Calvin. The magic was over. The last illusions melted away. After serving his sentence, Calvin returned to the city. He did not like to talk about his stay in prison. On all questions, parents answered sparingly. He was now legally unable to get a job as a lawyer. May changed her phone number. Through mutual acquaintances, he learned that she was about to marry some fashion designer with great prospects. Emma was upbeat. She had long ago disproved the doctor's assumptions that she was destined for a short life. The villagers still came to her to look into her kind eyes and believe in a bright future. She paid attention to everyone. She was still the sunny little girl that Betty the witch doctor saw in her. David and Barbara had a daughter, Megan, a year ago. There was no other name for her, her parents had decided. Dr. David has finally moved to the village, settling into his inpatient office. Now people from both the city and the region were coming to see him. Calvin carefully washed a window in the restaurant, fulfilling the task of the cleaning company, which he miraculously managed to get a job in. A chance meeting with May's friend, who had been in the cleaning business for a long time, had helped. This young lady was once very jealous of May and had a little crush on her handsome boyfriend. Now Calvin has already lost his former gloss, has become somehow vague and shabby. A woman's heart is not made of stone. The owner of the cleaning company really needed a tall, strong worker, not afraid of heights. Her female employees were afraid of working at heights. Word of mouth, she offered Calvin the vacant position. He enthusiastically accepted. I must say, he was surprisingly fast and high quality, as if he was born for this job. Now the man in overalls, carefully rubbing the shiny surface with a special compound, began to rub the formed deposit of thick white foam over the entire area of the glass. A blue foreign car pulled up in front of the restaurant. An imposing man came out of the saloon, holding the hand of a boy of about 3 or 4 years old. Next to him, a lovely woman with a little girl in a beautiful dress in her arms stood proudly. Calvin couldn't believe his eyes at first. It was his ex-wife Barbara, but so charming, full of aristocratic dignity. And when he thought, we have English roots, hence the lords and ladies. Misty Albion. No wonder he splashed the foam on the glass once more, endeavoring to rub the surface of it to an incredible luster. It seemed to him now that this was his way of washing his tangled soul. He had once dropped his dignity, his happiness, and his future to the ground. Would he be able to pick it up? A widow with many children was weeping bitterly at her husband's grave, and as soon as her shoulder was touched. For 4 years, Joyce had not believed in happiness. Once she had everything a woman could wish for: a loving husband, Albert, 3 wonderful children, a beautiful flat in the center, exotic trips once a year with the whole family to the end of the world, an expensive car. But everything changed dramatically when Albert died. The man was coming home late at night. A meeting had gone long. At work, he never particularly did not spare himself, realizing that a large family must be decently provided for. The job took up a lot of his time, but even with his busy schedule, he found days that he could devote to Joyce and the kids. That unfortunate night, Albert sat behind the wheel very tired. Their company was preparing for an important project, so the man hadn't slept much in the last few days. The road was empty, so at some point Albert relaxed and apparently lost his guard. He simply did not notice the impending danger. At the junction, a lorry slammed into him at full speed. There was no chance of survival. Looking at the traffic camera footage, Joyce realized that if Albert had slowed down for even a fraction of a second before the junction, the terrible tragedy would have been avoided. Inattention and fatigue were to blame, as well as the lorry driver who had arrogantly hoped to run through the junction on red. There's no point in blaming anyone now. Albert can't be brought back. It took Joyce a long time to accept what had happened when she received a call from the police. The woman was convinced that she had been the victim of a prank or fraudsters who swindled gullible relatives out of money by reporting trouble with family members. But something in the caller's tone alerted her. Senior Lieutenant Morris, as the man had introduced himself, was waiting for her at the district morgue. It took Joyce 10 minutes to get there, almost getting into an accident on the way. She entered the building on woozy legs. "This is crazy," the woman told herself. "This is a mistake. Albert's at work, he just got held up." And the fact that the phone was silent was just to keep her busy. Joyce, a man's voice called out to her. Turning round, Joyce saw a young boy standing in front of her. If he hadn't unfolded the law enforcement badge, she would never have believed he was an officer. Joyce, Senior Lieutenant Morris continued. "My name is Ethan. You and I have been chatting on the phone." Yes, Joyce responded uncertainly. "Where is he?" "Ethan, can I see him?" "Perhaps that's not the best idea," the young man replied, somehow embarrassed. "You see, the accident is terrible. There's hardly anything left of the car. And your husband. I've called you in now, rather to identify your personal belongings. I don't think it's wise to identify a body in your condition." Everything inside clenched. Joyce didn't understand how anyone could speak so callously about her husband. She still held out hope that someone else had died. There weren't many other Albertans in their big city. The policeman led the woman into a small room. Another young man sat at a desk, concentrating on typing something into his phone. Kyle Morris addressed him. "Get the evidence bag." Kyle lazily pulled open a desk drawer and extracted a clear plastic bag containing some red-stained items. "Here, Joyce, take a look at this." Ethan began laying the contents out on the table. "Do you recognize any of these items?" She was about to declare, without looking, that this was the first time she'd ever seen any of this. But then the gold pendant she'd given her husband on their wedding anniversary caught her eye. The woman reached for the shiny rectangle, but her legs gave out. Ethan managed to pull up a chair for her. Everything in front of Joyce's eyes swam. She drank the water offered by the policeman. "Yes, those are my husband's things," the woman spoke in a trembling voice. "We need to make our way to the station now, fill out paperwork, and watch the security footage." Morris addressed her. Joyce didn't care anymore. Her whole world had collapsed overnight. What did she care about paperwork? She had fallen into a kind of half-remembered oblivion and reacted to the words of the staff, clutching Albert's pendant tightly in her hand. All she cared about now was how to tell her children that their daddy was gone. After the funeral, Joyce had stopped caring about what was going on around her. The children were looked after by a nanny, and Joyce herself began to drink in secret. To the housekeeper's criticism of her constant pulling of bottles out of the bin, the woman did not react. She locked herself in her room and spent long hours looking at pictures of their once happy family. This went on for months. Waking up on a frosty winter morning with a severe headache, Joyce felt as if she had woken up. She looked around at the mess around her and cried. Only now did she finally realize that Albert would never again come into their bedroom, hug her, or call her to eat the cheesecakes he always made for the family on weekends. When the woman left the room, the first thing she did was head to the kitchen. Everyone in the house was still asleep. The clock showed only the beginning of 7. Joyce was determined to prepare her husband's speciality. Her relaxed body didn't obey her. It was only on the 3rd attempt that she managed to knead the dough. When the last cheesecake was transferred from the pan to the plate, Catherine came into the kitchen. Her eldest daughter was 8, but she was remarkably advanced for her age. "Mummy?" the little girl wondered. "Are you up already?" "Yes," Catherine, the woman, tried to smile and hugged her daughter tightly. "I wasn't feeling well, but I'm fine now." "You made Daddy's cheesecakes," Catherine wondered. Of all the children, she was the only one to realize that her father was gone. James, who was only 5, cried for a long time, but he couldn't understand what was happening. Elizabeth was just a baby, unable to comprehend such information. "Mummy, are we going to have things back to normal now?" Catherine asked hopefully. "Yes," Catherine. Joyce sighed heavily. "It won't be the same. But we're strong, aren't we? We'll try to manage somehow." Catherine sat looking at her mother with a confused look. The girl could hardly believe her words. The woman had lost a lot of weight. Always neat, stylish hair turned into some kind of crow's nest. Under the eyes, darkened horrible circles. Her hands were treacherously shaking. "You know what?" Joyce suddenly suggested. "Why don't we have a beauty day this morning? Just the 2 of us." They used to have this kind of entertainment regularly, having been the first in the family. Catherine had everything a little girl could want. Therefore, hearing her mother's proposal, the daughter, without hesitation, agreed. While they were talking, James and Elizabeth entered the kitchen, accompanied by Cassandra and the Harrison family's invariable nanny. His brother held the little girl's hand with care, leading her like a princess. "Mammy," the little one shouted with glee as they embraced her. They were used to seeing their mother in the kitchen in the mornings. Joyce rarely left the room, trying not to let the children notice her condition. "My good ones." Joyce smiled as she hugged the little ones. "Good morning, Cassandra." "Good morning. I see you're in a good mood today," Cassandra replied gently. There was relief in the woman's eyes. She had been worried about Joyce lately. She had been working for the family for 8 years now. In that time, she had grown accustomed to everyone as family. With Albert's death, everything had changed. But watching Joyce fade away was unbearable. Cassandra had moved in willingly to help out and take on some of the responsibilities of a hostess. "And Cassandra," Catherine said to Nanny, "Mummy and I are having a beauty day today." "Oh, you don't say, my dear. It's about time. It's better than being cooped up in 4 walls." After breakfast, Joyce and Catherine went on their beauty expedition, as they called their visit to the salon. Joyce was quickly tidied up and Catherine had her charming braids braided. However, there was a hitch at reception. "Ladies, the payment didn't go through," said the receptionist, smiling guiltily. "Let's try again. It happens sometimes." When the payment failed several more times, Joyce became seriously worried. Taking cash out of her purse, the woman paid. Getting into her car, she called the bank and reported her problem. Joyce, the employee, answered politely, "You see, the account to which your card is linked has been frozen. I can't give you the details over the phone. Come to the office." Joyce and Albert shared an account. The woman never gave much thought to how much money was in there, knowing her husband made a very good living. The message about the freeze left her confused. "Of course, it's some kind of technical glitch," the woman convinced herself. "Now I will go to the bank and find out everything." But the bank said nothing comforting. On the contrary, the situation seemed much worse. The account was arrested and blocked. Albert had some debts that Joyce had no idea about. "They never had any secrets from each other," the manager said monotonously. "Even if you inherit now, You can't unfreeze the account. By law, debts are inherited too. So what's left? Either sue, trying to recover the money, or accept it. Neither of which Joyce was happy with. Suddenly fear came to her throat. What is this? The woman thought with horror. There's no money. What am I supposed to do now? Joyce had never worked, having been fortunate enough to marry a wealthy and promising man. A student, Joyce initially worked part-time as a translator, dreaming of a career as an international translator. But her husband was adamant. I am capable of providing for you so that you will not deny yourself anything for the rest of your life. Joyce never went to work, and then Catherine appeared, and the woman devoted herself entirely to her family. Joyce grinned. For the rest of her days. Who knew how things would turn out? Right now, the woman was concerned about the children. Of course, there was some cash at home, and the jewelry could be sold. Enough for the first time, but money was running out at supersonic speed. Used to living large, Joyce didn't know where her finances were going. At some point, she suddenly realized that she had run out of money altogether. The jewelry had been sold. The contents of her husband's safe were rapidly melting away. There was nothing to do, so she went to Cassandra for advice. Cassandra, the woman, began softly, stepping noiselessly into the kitchen, where the nanny was preparing something. Oh, for heaven's sake, Joyce, why are you so frightened? The lady standing at the cooker literally jumped up and down. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Joyce tried to justify herself. I've got something to talk to you about. Yes, the nanny said, wiping her hands on her apron and sitting down at the table. Joyce didn't know where to begin. But there was no one closer than Cassandra right now. She was the only person Joyce could talk to normally. Cassandra, I don't have any more money on me, she began. What do you mean, Joyce? And the woman looked at her understandingly. What do you mean you don't have any? I always thought Albert was earning enough to give your grandchildren a good old age. He did. Joyce sighed, but he had some debts. Huge debts. I've been to the bank and all the accounts are blocked. I've been spending the cash in the safe for 2 months now. I've sold most of my jewelry. Joyce, are you serious now? Cassandra exclaimed as if she couldn't believe it. Why didn't you tell me before? It's not a minor problem. You have children. It was embarrassing. Joyce excused herself. I've never been very good at counting money. It was Albert's job. He never let me in on things. Turns out money does run out. I don't know what to do now. You have to get a job before it's too late, Nanny said firmly. A job? I've never had a job, Joyce replied. You know, I got married straight out of college. Albert wouldn't let me earn my own money. Well, you have a good specialty, Cassandra said. There's always a need for translators. Cassandra didn't give up. Where would they take me? I graduated 10 years ago. No experience, nothing. Joyce disagreed. It's okay, the nanny continued. Work on the internet. I think translations are always in demand. Anyway, you never know without trying. That's true, Joyce sighed. Do you think it pays all right? It's all right, it's not all right. It's enough to live on. You'll have to tighten your belts, of course, but it's up to you, you know. I won't leave you in the lurch, but it's time you got things under control. Hello, Martin. Joyce was visibly agitated as she dialed the number of her husband's friend and companion. This is Joyce Harrison, she introduced herself. Joyce, hello. Where have you been? The man was very surprised. I rang. You didn't answer the phone. I haven't seen you since the funeral. Well, you know, I was in such a state I didn't want to see anyone. Joyce sighed heavily. Martin, I need to talk to you. It's a serious problem. I think you can help me. No problem, Martin answered in a confident tone, giving Joyce hope. Half an hour later, Martin was in the flat. It had been 6 months since he had visited his friends. Without Albert here, everything seemed somehow alien. The men had been friends since high school. They'd been through a lot. They opened their own business, shared both profits and losses. After the wedding, Albert was a little distant, but Martin did not take offense. He understood everything. He had no family of his own. His personal life was replaced by his favorite job. Joint business did not connect them for a long time. He accumulated capital. Albert went on a solo voyage, engaged in real estate, and Martin remained a small businessman. But doing what he loved, it didn't affect their friendship. "What happened to you?" the man asked. Martin Joyce began. "Tell me, did you know anything about Albert's business?" "What do you mean?" "Well, I was at the solicitor's yesterday. I'm about to inherit the estate. It's been 6 months. I've got to make it official," Joyce suddenly stammered. And Martin didn't quite understand what she was getting at, or what it was about the inheritance. What's the next step? Isn't it a joy to get millions and not know where to put it? So she turned to an old friend for help. Joyce continued. "No," Joyce said in a tone that alerted Martin. "You see, Albert had huge debts. He never said anything to me about it. So I was wondering if you knew anything. They showed me some papers, some loans, some private loans, some receipts. And now I've got to pay it all back, you know." "What are you talking about?" Martin was genuinely surprised. "What debts? I always thought that you were doing very well." "I was jealous, to be honest." "So? It's a lot of money. Astronomical. I don't understand it myself. I thought he was making good money." "I spoke to Jack, his assistant, well, he told me that Albert had been really looking to expand lately. He's probably got the money to do it. I just can't understand why he didn't do it on behalf of the company." "I take it you're worried," Martin said, "and how much is there to pay?" "A lot to pay out," Joyce sighed. "They blocked all the accounts, but I'm still short. I think I'm going to have to sell the flat." "Really?" Martin was genuinely surprised. The sum seemed to be really impressive. In his estimation, the Harrison flat was worth a lot. Center, prestigious building, huge space, designer finishes. Joyce had told him how much he needed to pay off his debts. Martin even whistled in surprise. "Tell me, will you help me with the deal?" Joyce asked. I don't know anything about this sort of thing. I'm afraid of running into crooks and losing the price." "No problem," Joyce said persuasively. "Tell me, where are you going to live? Maybe a cheaper option. I realize you're used to luxury, but you don't have much choice now. As they say, it's not a matter of living large, it's a matter of living well." "Of course, Martin, I've had to say goodbye to luxury," Joyce agreed. "And it would be nice to have enough for a 2-bedroom in the suburbs. There are 4 of us, after all, but there's no need to consider a decent one." "I understand," Martin nodded. "I'll try to find suitable options." "All right, I'll get started right away so it won't take too long. Let me take a picture of the flat. I've got a good realtor in the neighborhood. He won't let you down." Mammy James interjected, "Where's my room?" "This is where you and Catherine will live." Joyce opened the door to the tiny bedroom. "We'll put the beds here, and there's a table and a wardrobe." "No, I don't want to live with Catherine. She's mean and greedy. I want my room back." The little boy whimpered. "Honey, we're going to live here now. Don't you love it? Look how green the yard is. You'll even have your own tree." By your own tree, Joyce meant a huge cherry tree, whose branches were literally breaking through the window of the future nursery. "And Elizabeth?" James persisted. "Elizabeth will live with me. There's plenty of room for us." Trying to smile, Joyce answered her son. Catherine entered the room. The girl's face showed that she was not happy about her new home either. "Mama," she began, "tell me, are we poor now?" "What are you saying?" Joyce tried to evade, though she knew it was useless to deceive her daughter. "Well," Catherine looked at her seriously, "the whole flat is smaller than our kitchen. And we drove an hour to get here. Why are we moving?" "Mummy, I'm not stupid. Just tell it like it is." Joyce took her daughter aside. She didn't want James to get hysterical when he caught some of the phrases. "Daughter," she began, "I don't want to deceive you. You're right, we don't have any more money. It's just the way things are. But now we have to learn to live again. I had to sell the flat. A lot of things will change. But the important thing is to stay together. Isn't it?" Joyce looked hopefully at her daughter. The girl's mind was going through an intense process. She seemed to be relating what she had heard to everything that had happened lately. For a moment her eyes lit up. "Aunt Cassandra isn't coming back, is she?" Catherine asked disappointedly. "If we don't have any more money, we won't be able to pay her." "Catherine," Joyce hastened to reassure her. "Cassandra won't leave us, we're like family to her. It's just that we will see her less often because she will have to work somewhere else. But she'll be happy to come round at weekends, won't she?" "Who's going to look after Elizabeth and James then, whilst at school?" the girl asked. "Well, I'm working at home for the time being, and then I'm thinking of putting them in kindergarten," her mother said with sincere faith in her voice. "And you yourself are ready to move to a new school?" continued questioning Catherine. "Mummy, I understand everything. I'm already quite big," she said in a serious tone. "What does it matter where to study? I can think for myself." Sometimes Joyce was amazed at how mature her daughter was. They couldn't afford the old grammar school. Thank goodness they had managed to get the child into a neighborhood school, which was really quite good. But still it is a stress for the girl, accustomed to classmates and individual approach of teachers. And with kindergarten for the younger ones, it was necessary to solve something. It turned out that it was not enough just to bring the children. The queue was huge, and Joyce could not afford a private institution. The cost of attendance seemed exorbitant. And then there were the two children. Cassandra's services, of course, had to be dispensed with as well. The kind woman had agreed to help with the household chores, but Joyce felt she had no right to exploit her all the time. She managed to find some work, but translations from French were of little interest now. Everywhere there was a need for specialists in Asian languages, of which the former student had only a vague idea. Anything she could earn was gone in a flash. The money left after paying all Albert's debts was barely enough for a small flat in a residential area and a small reserve, which Joyce put aside for the last resort. There was still a car, but a woman with 3 children didn't want to deprive herself of mobility, although the maintenance of a premium car also cost a lot of money. Attempts to get an official job as an interpreter in an international company failed. Seeing a spectacular, well-dressed woman, job seekers managers willingly escorted her to their offices, but her lack of experience and 3 children immediately turned them against Joyce. After a few such interviews, she gave up trying. Such conversations hurt her ego. So, and remained, in his opinion, forced to work part-time casual translations of modern French authors. The editor was in no hurry to pile orders, so the cash flow in the family did not turn into a stormy river. 6 months after the move, Joyce realized that the money is catastrophically lacking. She still had to sell the car, exchanging it for a simpler car. The school Catherine went to, although it was not elite, still required huge expenses. They were constantly collecting money for repairs, for gifts for teachers, for something else. The last thing Joyce wanted was for her classmates and teachers to be prejudiced against Catherine because of her family's difficult financial situation, so she paid all the exorbitant fees. "That's the way it is in all schools, Judy," an old friend who was one of the few people Joyce kept in touch with after her husband Albert's death, once said. The rest of her friends had evaporated as soon as they felt there were no benefits to be gained from their relationship with Albert. And the widow might ask the widow for a loan. No one was in any hurry to part with the money. Joyce was a proud person, but nobody cared much about that aspect. So she was left with her university friend Judy, Martin, and Cassandra. They supported the single mom as best they could. But in today's world, it's hard enough to stay afloat without a financial backstop. "You know what, Joyce?" Judy continued. "I've got an acquaintance who's opening a private kindergarten with some experimental methods of education. Not many clients yet, as the prices aren't too steep. Maybe I could put in a good word with her about your kids. She is a person who understands, responsive, and in trouble will not abandon. I think we can negotiate a discount. You still have to find a job, no matter what. With the kids at home, it's out of the question." That's true, Joyce thought. But I doubt if I can afford even a small amount of money. "Please leave that to me," said Judy. "I'll arrange it. We'll make it all right. I can't help you with the job, unfortunately. You know I'm not very good at it myself." Just as Judy had said, the owner of the daycare center had come to an agreeable arrangement. Joyce was relieved to trust the children to this woman, who, as it turned out, lived nearby and even offered to bring them home. Joyce immediately started looking for a job, hoping for some prestigious, high-paying position. It didn't work out, First, she got a job as an administrator in a beauty parlor, but she couldn't work there for a month. The relationship with the owner, who for some reason immediately disliked the newcomer, did not work out. Joyce did not have any working speciality, although there were a lot of similar vacancies, and the salary was promised to be good. There were still options, which the woman was prevented from considering by her pride. But could a person with a higher education go as a cashier or food packer in a supermarket? Joyce tried delivery, so popular with the younger generation, but after a few orders brought to her old acquaintance, she gave up the idea. And it was costing a lot of money in petrol. "Joyce, let's go to my office," as a manager Martin once suggested to her when he dropped in for tea. "We've got a girl going on maternity leave. I wouldn't want to bring in someone from outside. It's not a difficult job. Of course, I can't offer you a huge salary, but a full social package. Weekends like normal people, free meals." "Sure, I'll go," Joyce agreed without hesitation. That's how she joined Martin's firm. Things were not going well at the new place. No, the woman coped with her duties in full. But relations with her co-workers had been frayed from day one. All the women working for Martin were convinced that Joyce got her position because of the chief's favor. Some ladies were openly jealous of her striking appearance and were quick to invent another unflattering gossip about her private life. But Joyce paid no attention. All she was interested in was how to feed herself and her children. Besides, her job left her enough time to do translations. However, the woman had no weekends at all. Even joint walks with the kids remained only a dream. Thank God, Cassandra came to the rescue, helping to make ends meet. Joyce had learned to live without her husband. "Mummy," Catherine said from the doorway when she saw Joyce staring at her laptop. "I don't think you've forgotten, but I'll remind you. James turns 9 this Sunday, and we haven't even bought him a present yet." It's like Joyce woke up. "Are you serious? Sunday already? What's the date today?" "Oh, Mom, you're so funny," she marveled at her daughter. "Greetings to distant space travelers from Earthlings. On our planet today is Tuesday, the 4th of September. The time is 1837. "I'm really confused about the days at work," Joyce confessed. "It's been a nightmare today, and I've got a translation due. I couldn't get round to it." Joyce seemed exhausted. In the 4 years she had spent as a widow, a lot had changed in her life. She still worked for Martin. She was no longer the office manager, but his personal assistant. Her salary was rising in line with inflation. Joyce still hadn't learned how to cope with the problem of being broke. Catherine had become a teenager with growing needs. James had already started 3rd grade, and Elizabeth would be starting school next year. Joyce worked hard to give her children everything they needed. But quality clothes and newfangled gadgets cost a lot, and the woman did not want her favorite offspring to stand out from their peers. Of course, Catherine constantly argued with her in the shop, choosing things simpler and cheaper. But Joyce couldn't be persuaded. "Let me finish early tomorrow," her mother continued. "You and I will go shopping and pick out something interesting. Do you know what he'd like?" "Oh, Mum," Joyce. "Shame on you. You've forgotten all about us. You don't even know what your son is interested in." That's it, said Catherine. "I'm joking. I understand perfectly well. You're not a little girl, I know everything. I'll show you when we get there. We'll have to stop by the Albion shop." "All right, my daughter, whatever you say," gave up mother. "There should be enough money. I hope I've been saving." Catherine vanished out the door, leaving Joyce alone with her thoughts. 4th of September, the woman reflected. After all, the day after tomorrow will be 4 years since he's been gone. We'll at least have to go to the cemetery. Joyce went to her husband's grave once a year. She couldn't stand it any longer. To see his smiling face etched on the black granite slab. She couldn't. Immediately, a heavy wave of memories of the past came crashing down on the equally hard granite of the present. She had never taken the children with her. Only once Catherine had traveled with her, but seeing her daughter's tears was even more unbearable than her husband's stony smile. After leaving work early, Joyce took her usual route. Martin, having learnt where his assistant was going, offered to give her a lift. But it was important for Joyce to make the journey alone. There were no traffic jams yet, so she reached the cemetery quickly. On the way, she stopped at a flower shop and bought 4 snow-white roses tied with black satin ribbon. The shop assistant smiled sympathetically at her, adding even more tragedy to the situation. At the cemetery gate, Joyce did not see the typical picture of peddlers soliciting paper flowers. The beggars and cripples that usually sat along the paths were not present on a weekday. Only the sounds from the granite workshop and the few wreaths gathered near the entrance reminded her that this place still had something to do with the world of the living. Joyce walked with an uncertain gait, noting on the way the landmarks she remembered from her previous visits: the lush fence, the graves of some authority figure from the 90s, the sad angel mourning a 5-year-old girl who had left the world. A rubbish bin topped with a pile of colored funeral wreaths. Spotting a bifurcated birch tree, the woman turned onto the path on the right. Here we go, just a little further and I'll be there, Joyce thought, sinking her heels into the soft ground. The birch trees were already beginning to turn yellow. Ahead could be seen a granite slab gleaming in the sun, casting a sort of somber golden glow. 2 huge ravens sat on the table, eating something left over from an offering to the dead with gusto. There were plastic bottles lying everywhere, wilted flower heads, dry branches. Doesn't anyone really clean up around here, Joyce thought. Is it so hard to take the rubbish away with you? Well, here I am, she said in a shaky voice, squatting down in front of the ever-smiling Albert. I'm sorry I'm alone and haven't been here in a while, love. I brought flowers. I know you didn't like them much, but it's tradition. With those words, Joyce put the roses in a jar of water, putting aside the withered remains of the ones from last time. And the children are all grown up now. Catherine's a real bride. You wouldn't even recognize her. She looks just like you. The woman pulled out her phone and started flipping through pictures of the kids. James is 9 now. Yesterday I went with Catherine to pick out a present for him. You'd think your son was into aeromodeling. They got him a plane like that. Catherine said he'd jump through the ceiling when he saw it, and Elizabeth is a year away from school. She's smart. She's already reading and writing. I even do French with her sometimes. Joyce sighed heavily, wiping away her tears with the palm of her hand. She didn't know what else to say to a dead man. All this superstition had never appealed to her. Even as a child, going to the cemetery with her relatives, she hadn't understood these meaningless conversations with the earth, libations of vodka on the grave, greetings and farewells. Well, a man is gone, he's gone. What can be done about it? What does he care about the survivors now? How am I doing? Joyce said, answering her own question, supposedly asked by the silent interlocutor. Same old, same old. I'm working for Martin. I don't know where we'd be now if it weren't for him. I don't make a lot of money, of course, but it's enough to live on. Cassandra's been very supportive. She's retired and often takes the younger ones to her cottage. I took them all summer, teaching them to garden. Elizabeth couldn't get out of the berry patch. And James has learnt to swim. I'm thinking of enrolling him in the pool. He needs sport anyway, Joyce said. For about 15 minutes, she sat in complete silence, immersed in her memories. The birdsong put her in a sort of meditative state. Suddenly, this calm was broken by a crackling noise. Joyce gave a startled shudder and looked round. An old man was standing not far from her, looking at her hesitantly. I'm sorry to startle you, the elderly man addressed Joyce peacefully. You see, it's Thursday. There's nobody here. And I'm lost again. I'm so lucky to have met you. No, not at all, the woman replied. You didn't scare me at all. I was just thinking and didn't expect anyone else to be here. Can I help you? If it's not too much trouble, could you help me find my wife's grave? It's been so many years and I keep getting lost in these gravestones. It's like she doesn't want me to see her like this, the old man smiled embarrassedly. Yes, of course, Joyce agreed, rising from the ground. Well, Albert, goodbye, I'll be off. I promise not to be discouraged. I'll give the children a hug. Joyce walked towards the old man, shaking off the hem of her cloak. She noticed he was holding a tiny bouquet of lavender. What a thing, she thought. I wonder where he found these flowers. And they don't look artificial. My name is Winston, the older man introduced himself. And I'm Joyce. Nice to meet you, Joyce, Winston said. I'm sorry we met in such a peculiar environment, the old man said apologetically. I see you're interested in my flowers. To be honest, yes, Joyce nodded. I didn't think you could find lavender in our town at this time of year. Even abroad, it's out of season. Are you interested? I am. Winston smiled. When my late wife and I went to Provence, we visited the lavender fields. The guide told us that these flowers are rarely found outside the country. They don't take root anywhere, that the climate is not suitable, or something else. So I was surprised it's just lavender. I grow them in my own greenhouse. All right, well, that's a bit of a mouthful, but what about lavender? My wife was very fond of lavender, Winston said. I didn't share that sentiment, but I can't come here empty-handed. I'd like to make her happy. Mary, he corrected himself. Oh yes, the old man was worried. Let's try to find the tombstone. I used to turn off at that stone bollard over there, but it's all changed in a year. It's weird. I can't find a white marble monument, not very tall, and there's a wrought iron bench next to it. Mary. Joyce looked around. She'd never taken much interest in who was buried next to her husband. A couple of rows to the right, she spotted several similarly described monuments and immediately headed for them. On the third try, she found the right grave. Winston, she called out. I think I found it. Come here. The old man wandered slowly between the rows of graves, trying not to stumble on the grassy paths that were slippery from the recent rain. Hello, Mary, he said cheerfully, kneeling down on the ground. Again, you didn't want me to come, and very wrongly. You're always thinking of yourself. You know what? I'll find him. Joyce was looking at the photograph on the monument. It was of an elderly but strikingly beautiful woman. There was something subtly oriental about her appearance, and her eyes were laughing, filled with childlike joy. Judging by the date on the plaque, the woman had died 10 years ago, and also on the 6th of September. As you can see, Joyce thought, that's quite a coincidence. I wonder what it was from. She wasn't very old. She must have been ill. Suddenly, the old man's voice broke the silence and interrupted her thoughts. He spoke in French. The last thing Joyce had expected to hear was French poetry. Not just any poetry, but an extract from a famous poem by Arthur Rimbaud, to whom she had dedicated her thesis. Rolling tides and in winter's cold. I ran, baffled as the mind of children and peninsulas, breaking away from the land, had not learnt the triumph of such wild passions. By itself, Joyce's translation of the stanza spoken by Winston succeeded. The old man froze, slowly turned his head in her direction, and looked with surprise at the woman for whom it had cost nothing not only to recognize a rare poem, but also to reproduce it in Russian. Well, well, he said. I see you like Rimbaud? You see, Joyce replied, sitting down on the bench. When I was a student, I studied French, and this poem by Rimbaud was the subject of my thesis. I'm literally fascinated by this young poet, because he didn't have much else to write. And this poem left a significant mark on French poetry and literature in general. To say that I was surprised to hear it here now, and in excellent French, is an understatement. Yes, Winston laughed. There are coincidences in life. And how can you not believe that everything in the world happens for a reason? Joyce, that poem. Mary was literally obsessed with it. My wife had an excellent knowledge of French, and as a young woman, she was fond of translating the classics. Then one day she came across Rimbaud, and you realize how difficult it was to get hold of such literature, even for students. She read the translation, but it seemed to her that it did not convey the essence of the original, and Mary was a very persistent and determined girl. So she decided to create her own translation. I have an old notebook at home in which my wife wrote down her versions, but she was never able to perfect them, as she thought. It would be very interesting to see it, Joyce said. I touched on the subject of translation during the defense, but it was about the popular versions. I'm interested purely from a professional point of view. If you're really interested, then you're welcome to visit, Winston replied. I live alone. My son got married a long time ago and moved to the capital. He visits once every couple of years, Winston continued. I'm afraid to fly. I've never even seen my grandchildren in person. Mary's gone. I'm a recluse. My friends have all left this world long ago. If it's not too much trouble, come and see me. I live near the Central Library, you know. Maybe the house with the columns in the original? I know, Joyce smiled. The old man's offer might have seemed dubious to some, but the woman felt that the man was very lonely, and the sincerity with which he told her the details of his life was endearing. Besides, Joyce really wanted to look at Rimbaud's translations. Her professional interest was making itself felt. "I'll definitely come. Let's do it tomorrow at 5 o'clock. It'll be convenient. I'll have a couple of hours to spare." Of course, assured her old man. "Come, I'll treat you to a specialty coffee. A woman's recipe. I'll leave you my phone number. If anything changes, let me know." The new acquaintances stayed at the cemetery for some time, and then Joyce kindly offered to give Winston a lift home. All the way he told her about the peculiarities of growing flowers in the greenhouse. Joyce had never realized it could be so interesting. She returned home in high spirits. Catherine had already come home from school. "We must eat quickly," Joyce said. Mother and daughter went to the kindergarten. Elizabeth managed to get into a fight with a boy who was pulling her braids. The conflict ended with a torn shirt. The child's angry mother demanded compensation from Joyce for the spoilt item. Unwilling to listen to an explanation, Joyce silently pulled out the money. Noticing that the purse was almost empty, she muttered, "Yes, it's still a couple of days before payday." She didn't scold Elizabeth, noting only, "A real lady would not defend her honor with her fists, but would seek revenge using her intelligence." "How's that, Mummy? I don't understand." "You and I will definitely talk about it, but a little later. But I'm still glad you didn't let yourself be offended." "Mum," Catherine intervened in the conversation, "why did you give that bitch the money? It's clear that it's her child's fault." "If you'd stayed out of it, you'd still be in one piece," Catherine said. "Sometimes you have to give in," said the mother. "I realize what a conflict would lead to now. We'd have a fight with her. She still won't admit that her son is at fault. After all, then I will question her love and methods of upbringing. And there's no way to prove anything to an offended soul. He'd end up attacking Alex again tomorrow, only with his mother's encouragement. And now we'll teach our princess how to take revenge on the offender without using fists, so that she won't bother again. And this, as you called her, bitch doesn't have enough brains to realize that her son was insulted." "Well, Mum," Catherine stretched out, laughed, "what a sly one you are." Having finished her work, Joyce remembered that she had promised to stop by Winston's. She called her eldest daughter and arranged for her to pick Elizabeth up from kindergarten, telling her that she would be a little late. Mum Catherine piped up, "Are you late for work, or are you going on a date?" "What date, baby?" Joyce laughed. "I've got an appointment. I'll try not to be long. Okay?" "All right," Catherine whispered, "don't worry." Joyce bought some cakes on the way. She didn't want to go to the house empty-handed. She knew a good bakery that sold inexpensive but delicious sweets. She liked to take her children there when she had free time for a joint day off. The woman parked in front of the impressive stuccoed front door, noting that the house where the old man lived did not look simple, even by modern standards. In the old days, representatives of the ruling elite, diplomats, academics, high-ranking officials lived in such Stalinist high-rises. But today, only very wealthy people could afford a flat in such an architectural object. Winston lived on the 7th, top floor. Joyce took a rare lift with a sliding cast-iron grille and noticed the rich decoration of the stairwell. The walls were decorated with moldings, the marble floors were clean, and each door had a gilded plaque with the initials of the owners. When she rang the bell at the door that said Winston lived behind it, the woman waited a long time for the door to be opened. Winston greeted her with a broad smile. The old man was dressed in an immaculately tailored gray woolen suit that made him look much younger. "Good evening, dear Joyce." The man greeted her. "I didn't expect you to come." "Why not?" the woman asked, embarrassed. "Well, you'd have to admit, meeting in a cemetery is a rather dubious way to start a relationship," the older man smiled. "Though, considering the way life flows nowadays, it's surprising that strangers can even talk to each other and find a common theme." "I confess," Joyce replied, "I am driven by professional interest, and I'd like to try your advertised coffee. I brought some cakes, too." "Thank you." Winston took the bundle of treats. "Please come in." Joyce walked into the huge living room. The flat had high ceilings of at least 4 meters. One wall of the spacious room was completely filled with shelves of books. On the shelves were whole collections of rare editions, which the owner of the library had collected for decades. There were even some ancient-looking medieval manuscripts and editions with traces of time on their covers. Apparently, the owner of the flat was a man extremely well-read. The order of the bookshelves made it clear that the contents were not just decoration or an attempt to impress. "I see you like my little collection?" Winston asked, bringing trays of coffee and sweets into the room. "It's quite small," Joyce said, still looking at the books. "There are at least 2,000 volumes here." 3,047. "To be exact," said the old man. "There were more, but when Mary died, I donated some of it to the university library, as she had willed. And now that I'm retired, I can't afford to read as much as I used to. My eyesight's not what it used to be. And it was more interesting to discuss what I read with Mary than to be alone with my opinions. Sometimes I'd open her favorite illustrated editions and just admire the drawings. Here, for example, Winston reached for one of the shelves, where there was a whole collection of brightly colored covers decorated with golden Arabic ornaments. Winston displayed Tales of 1001 Nights, an amazingly beautiful full-size book covered in silk with a glossy marbled insert depicting a tent in a flowering garden. "It's a 1913 French edition with illustrations," he said. "Oh my God, it's beautiful." Joyce marveled. "I'd never have realized that such copies were in private collections. It's a work of art." "You're right," smiled the old man. "Such collections can easily be sold at auctions for decent money. Today there are no more than 5 complete collections of such books. But I will not sell my fairy tales for any money. You see, they are not just well-preserved volumes, they are memories. Moments of happiness, forever gone, but also forever in my soul. Mary and I bought this collection in Paris, would you believe it, at a flea market, and for only 300 francs. Although at the time it seemed a fabulous sum to us. When Soviet citizens got to foreign countries, they bought everything that was different from their usual life. But for some reason, Mary and I did not go to fashionable shops and perfume shops, but went straight to hunting for antiques. The seller asked 400 francs for the books, but we had only 300 francs left. Seeing the fire in my wife's eyes, the merchant could not stand it and gave in. Probably then he regretted 1,000 times, because today the cost of such a collection is at least 30,000 euros. "Oh, really?" Joyce marveled. "Is it really true?" "It's true," sighed the old man. "So what good is money if you can't buy anything with it? Think about it. How can I, an old man, afford such a sum? It won't bring me joy. Shall I put it in the bank? What for? For a funeral, maybe. Because it's expensive. And it's expensive to send yourself to the next world for that kind of money. I'm not some pharaoh." Joyce laughed. Winston was right. She wondered what she would have done herself. If she owned such expensive books, she probably wouldn't hesitate to sell them. He's the one who doesn't need the money. Joyce has children to raise. Every penny counts. That kind of luxury is a thing of the past. What if the books belong to the children? Joyce wondered. Then, no, not at any price. It would be too low. She'd be better off scrubbing floors. She wouldn't sleep at night, but she wouldn't deny her family the right to such a treasure. Winston sipped his tea from a fine china cup. "Oh, what lovely coffee!" Joyce exclaimed. "I've never tasted anything like it." "I'm glad you appreciate my specialty recipe," laughed the old man, "though it's not quite right to call it your own. I learned to make coffee this way from an old Arab named Amin. His coffee shop was located in one of the old neighborhoods. Arabs appreciate coffee. For them, it's not just a drink, but a whole culture." "How interesting," Joyce exclaimed. "Have you traveled a lot?" "A lot," Winston sighed. "But Algeria is a special subject for Alice and me. You see, she was an interpreter at the embassy. She was sent to North Africa right after college. At that time, the Union was actively establishing relations with the Arab states. There weren't many specialists. That's where she and I met." "And you're a translator too?" Joyce was surprised. "No, not at all," smiled the old man. "I was an archaeologist." "An archaeologist?" Joyce marveled. "Yes, I agree. "It's not an ordinary profession," Winston replied. "For a long time our group had excavated all over the United States. My specialty is Orientalism. I lived in Uzbekistan for a long time. We found a lot of stuff there. But in the 70s I received an unusual offer from my university to go to Algeria to excavate in Jamil. Of course I agreed. It was practically impossible to go abroad at that time. I should not have refused such a chance. An interest, you can't deny it. But here we went to Africa. At first, of course, everything seemed wild, especially the unbearable heat and the absence of the usual amenities. We drove into the mountains. It was very hard to get there, and to be honest, it was scary. The very terrain and people were frightening, and our guide looked like a criminal. Jamil is an ancient Roman city. They began to study it in the early 20th century, so we were not pioneers, but we had to take into account that Algeria is not a developed country. No roads, no proper shops, and it's in the middle of nowhere. We had to carry all the luggage, provisions, and equipment on our backs. We had a few mules. I'm still amazed at how hardy they are. And Norman, the guide, even though he had a creepy appearance, turned out to be a reliable man. He saved us from many dangers. We were several months away from civilization, surrounded by ancient ruins. There were ghosts and creatures everywhere. But the scariest of all were the nights, or rather the cold that came with them. It's unbelievable when the temperature rises to +50 during the day and drops below 0 at night. In the mountains. Of course, it's a peculiar pleasure. But we were young and brave and obsessed with digging. "How did you and your wife meet?" Joyce asked. "And Mary?" Winston sighed. "Mary and I first met when our group was on its way home." The old man drew in more air, as if preparing to dive underwater. After a long pause, he began his story. The excavations at Jamil were a success. Winston's group managed to find the remains of thermal baths and well-preserved mosaic floors. They even managed to get hold of a few clay jugs, which were quite well preserved. Such a find was rare, so the archaeologists were already preparing to rest on their laurels of glory, having taken several hundred pictures, published dozens of articles in magazines, and carefully packed their equipment. The group intended to make the return journey in the morning. The last night began as usual. At first it was sharply cold. The guys built fires, cooked dinner, and sat down to tell stories. Life stories quickly became boring. Then the interpreter Norman began to pester Sid to tell them something interesting about this place, something he had encountered himself. The guy did not agree for a long time, but after persistent persuasion and a couple of shots of vodka, his tongue was loosened. "I had just started taking scientists to the ruins," Sid began. "My first group was 4 young Frenchmen," Sid said. "The War of Independence had just ended. The atmosphere here was not the most favorable, but I liked that these young people were free of prejudice and didn't hold their noses. There was a photographer among them. I think his name was Jean, though I could be wrong." They reached Jamil quickly. It was the beginning of September. It was not very hot during the day, so it was easy to walk. The boys set up camp at the site, and I went to harness the mules. "What's stopping us here?" Norman asked quickly. So it was decided to start the work in the morning. We were sitting by the fire, as we were now, and preparing to go to our tents. Suddenly, one of the guys noticed that Jean was gone. When the photographer left, no one noticed. At first, we thought he had gone to sleep in the tent. He didn't turn up. We went round the neighborhood, calling for him, trying to find him with torches, but no luck. The guy was gone without a trace. It's not hard to get lost here, but there's a risk of wandering into the mountains and falling into a crevasse. Sleep was out of the question. Every minute counted. We split into pairs and continued our search. Francois and I went into the mountains, and the other 2 lads went to explore the ruins. When dawn broke, my partner and I returned to camp. As we approached, Luke, one of the guys who had gone to the ruins, came running towards us. He was waving his arms and shouting at us to hurry up. We ran after him toward the amphitheater. There on the steps sat Eugene. His head was as white as chalk, though only yesterday he had been a burly brunette. He was frantically clutching his camera and muttering to himself the word Mopana. The guy seemed to be unable to see anyone or anything around him. His pupils were severely dilated and his lips were chapped. He did not respond to our words. We got him to the camp, gave him tea and put him to bed. By morning he seemed to have regained consciousness, but he remembered nothing at all. Perhaps he had managed to photograph something, but I was not to find out. As soon as the guys left, I never heard from them again. Sam broke the silence around the fire. You know, I went out of the tent last night to take a leak, and just in the area of the amphitheater I saw some kind of glow. I thought it looked like the moon was setting, even though it was overcast. What if it was haunted? That's a bit of a stretch, Sam said Norman. There's no such thing as ghosts. Yeah, Winston, the leader of the group, said skeptically. He had always thought such stories were rubbish. He wasn't going to believe them, but he couldn't sleep well after what he'd heard. When all the boys had gone to their tents, Winston lay still for a long time, wondering what the Frenchman could have seen in the ruins that he had turned gray overnight. Suddenly, his musings were interrupted by a crackling noise from the street. He poked his head out of the tent, but it was empty. Only the embers of the fire were slowly going out. He was about to climb back in when the crackling sound came again. The sound was loud and distinct, coming from the direction of the ruins. But no Winston muttered, climbing out of the tent. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like it was coming from the other side of the world. The boy did not wake anyone, and, armed with a strong lantern and a stout stick, set off in the direction of the amphitheater. There was someone in the center of the structure. Winston froze, not understanding how a person could be here. The logical explanation was that it was someone from the camp, but the figure was dressed in something light-colored, covering almost the entire body. Winston gripped the stick tighter and aimed the beam of light at the man sitting below. "Hey, what are you doing here?" shouted the archaeologist. The figure didn't move. Oliver sank down a couple of steps and froze, sweating with fear. Had the boys decided to play a trick on him, knowing how he felt about all sorts of mysticism? "Norman," he shouted, "if they're trying to scare me, it won't work. I'm going to use this stick." Winston confidently ran down the steps and approached the figure, swinging the stick. Suddenly the figure rose sharply and turned round. The lantern illuminated a woman's face covered in blood. Winston stepped back, paralyzed with fear. The woman stared at him in silence. "Who are you?" Winston spoke in plain English. "Do you need help? We have a first aid kit. I'll get it for you. Just don't go anywhere. Do you understand me? I'll be back." He was about to leave when suddenly the woman grabbed his arm and addressed him in clear Russian. "You're not a hallucination, you're real. Are you here alone? I didn't hope for help anymore. You see, our motorcade was attacked. We were on our way to Seattle, but we got trapped on the way. Some men pulled us out of our cars, started pushing us around, trying to get us into their truck. I managed to get away. You see, it's getting dark fast. I know the city's not far away, but I'm totally disorientated. I came across these ruins and decided to wait out the night. But it's very cold. If it wasn't for you, I think I'd have frozen to death by morning." Only now Winston noticed that the stranger was wearing a silk business suit that was stained and torn in places, and what he took for a blanket was a jumper and an Arab headscarf. "Lord, let's go to the camp," Oliver exclaimed, taking the woman under his arm. "Can you walk?" "I think so," she answered. "Only my heel seems to be broken." Winston helped her to the camp, lit a fire and sat her on a bench. From the tent he got 2 blankets and a first aid kit. Treating the wound on the stranger's face, the guy saw that she was still quite young, no more than 25 years old. "What is your name?" asked the archaeologist. "My name is Winston. I am an American archaeologist who by fate found himself in this wilderness." "And I'm Mary," the girl answered and even tried to smile. It was obvious that she was still frightened. "Mary Smith. I work at the American Embassy as an interpreter. We traveled from Algeria on a diplomatic mission to a local university. But as I said, we were attacked on the way." "God, what about Sebastian and the others?" She continued confusedly. "I'm the only one who escaped." The girl appeared greatly disturbed. Winston, too, was alerted to the fact that bandits might be lurking nearby. Of course, they had a few guns in the camp, but they could hardly serve as a good defense. "There's no point in worrying about that now," the archaeologist said hastily. "You can't help anyway. Tomorrow we will go down to the city. And there we will think what to do in this situation." Right now you should be glad that you were not captured by these bandits and did not die in the mountains." Norman's head emerged from the tent. Loud voices woke him up. The others also seemed to wake up. In a minute, the whole group was already sitting around the fire. They were surprised at the appearance of a woman in the camp, and a very beautiful one at that. Nobody fell asleep till morning. First, everyone listened to the story of the appearance of a stranger in the camp, and the remaining few hours were on duty. In the morning, the archaeologists loaded their loads onto mules and set off for town. Mary was placed on one of the pack animals, and Winston walked beside her, ready to support her at any moment. You know, if Syed hadn't told us that terrible story the night before Winston began, I'd be fast asleep. I'm afraid to imagine what would have happened to you." "What was the story?" Mary asked. "Was it about ghosts in Roman ruins?" "Exactly," laughed the boy. "I don't believe in all that, of course, but somewhere inside there's still hope that there's something left after death." "And I believe that we don't go away forever," she said sadly. At the gendarmerie, Mary explained at length to an officer in mirror-polished shoes and white gloves. "What happened yesterday?" The officer called somewhere several times, making the girl languish in suspense. Winston never left her side. The rest of the guys had gone to a hotel to rest. He realized there was no way Mary could be left alone. After a couple of hours spent in the station, it was learnt that the diplomatic motorcade was attacked by a group of radicals opponents of the ruling party. At that time, relations between the United States and Algeria were developing very unfavorably. But there were those who were against it. The diplomats were taken prisoner and ransomed. Mary got through to the embassy and learnt that the negotiations had been successful and that her colleagues would soon be safe. The other end of the line was very happy to hear that the girl was all right. They offered to send a car for her, but Mary refused, preferring to get to the capital by train. Winston was very pleased with this option. It meant that for some time he would be able to continue his acquaintance with this amazing girl. After all, his group also had to take the train to get to the international airport. In the capital, Mary escorted Winston to his flight. Before boarding, they exchanged addresses and phone numbers. A year later, the girl returned to her homeland. By that time, between the young people, there were real feelings. And Winston, in order to please his beloved, even began to learn French. Mary was transferred to the consulate. She sometimes had to go to North Africa, but most of the time she spent in the United States. Winston tried to match his expeditions to his friends' business trips, so it turned out to spend more time together. 2 years later, lovers played a wedding. Winston did not dote on his girlfriend. The girl shared all his hobbies, charged love for her own, so the newlyweds always had something to talk about. Hot arguments caused a discussion of literature. Mary passionately collected books, and if Winston preferred history and architecture, she grabbed every volume of poetry. On their honeymoon, they managed to go not anywhere, but to France. For American citizens, such a trip was something from the category of fantasy. Not everyone could afford to see the Eiffel Tower, but Mary's job at a foreign consulate was a great advantage. She was offered to accompany a high-ranking official to an international forum. The event was to last 3 days, and Mary could stay in a foreign country for another week. And to her great joy, she was allowed to take one relative with her. While his wife attended social receptions, Winston wandered around Paris, took lots of photographs, and practiced his conversational French. A simple American was fascinated by this majestic city. Architectural delights struck his imagination, and people conquered by their hospitality. When Mary's official activities were over, the couple could finally enjoy all this splendor together. The young wife dragged Winston to flea markets, museums, and cozy coffee houses. And at night they took long walks along the Seine embankment and dreamed of the future, enjoying the present. A year later, the couple had a son, Alex. Mary was over the moon with happiness. She inherited from her grandfather a huge flat in the center, where the couple immediately moved. Winston was swamped with work. He was sent to Fort Worth, near which were large-scale excavations of ancient sites. For 5 years, he was home for a maximum of 2 months a year. Mary almost completely took over the upbringing of her son, but even such long absences could not spoil the relationship between the spouses. On those rare days when Winston was home, he tried to make up for the entire period of his absence. Mary and little Alex marveled at how Daddy had so much energy and ideas for things to do together. He organized large-scale excursions around the city, took them to the countryside, arranged some fantastic costume plays at home, and still as heatedly argued with his wife about literary preferences. Finally, his forced exile ended and Winston sighed calmly, except that it became uneasy outside the window. The country was about to undergo a change of power, which some awaited with excitement, others with fear. By 1985, Winston, who successfully defended his doctorate, has already led his own archaeological unit at the university. He rarely traveled to the field, swamped with paperwork. By that time, the man had not yet turned 40, so he was very frustrated by the lack of practical research. Mary continued to work at the consulate, where she returned after her maternity leave. She didn't even have to worry about a position. There were only a handful of specialists like her. And thanks to her natural charm, even conflicts between delegations could be resolved. Alex was already in the 3rd grade and proudly wore a bright red pioneer tie around his neck. Unlike his parents, the boy had an extraordinary passion for English. Mary did her best to send him to one of the most prestigious language schools. By the standards of society, their family was considered exemplary, intelligent, educated, beautiful. The neighbors were especially envious of the fact that the couple never quarreled. Quarrels simply did not fit in their heads. How could they quarrel, living soul to soul? But the couple paid absolutely no attention to what was going on around them. Even suddenly fallen on the country, hard times could not break their strong family. When what was considered an unshakable power began to fall apart, Winston lost his job. No one cared about the ruins of the past when the ruins of the present formed all around. The couple were lucky. Mary was offered a long-term business trip, this time to Canada. The woman agreed without delay, realizing what could happen in her native country in the coming years. The most painful part of the move was perceived by Alex. By that time, he was going through a difficult period of teenage maximalism. Especially, he was in love with his classmate and almost ran away on the eve of the flight. But Winston had a serious talk with his son, convincing him of the need for a temporary move. In Canada, the boy came in handy excellent knowledge of English. He quickly adapted to school and made new friends. Winston managed to get a job as a consultant at the Faculty of Archaeology at the University of Montreal. The couple returned to the States only in 2008, when the country was recovering from another crisis. Alex stayed in Canada, by then enrolled in college. For some reason, Mary was sure that her son would never return to the States. As it turned out, she was right. Alex finished college in Canada, then got a job in New York, married well, and only occasionally came to visit his parents. The couple returned to their luxurious flat, which had been rented for the past few years by a German diplomat. Mary was delighted to find that her favorite books had literally been dusted off. The life of husband and wife flowed again in the usual course. Winston found an interesting niche for himself, consulting and organizing private archaeological expeditions, the demand for which increased sharply by 2000. At home, he only had time to wonder where, and his wife by that time has already passed the 50-year milestone. So much energy. The woman left the civil service and took up tutoring. She liked teaching students French. Young people listened with interest to her stories about her amazing travels in French-speaking countries. And then a terrible thing happened. Mary had a stroke. She was completely paralyzed on the right side of her body. It happened on 6th September 2002. Winston was away at the time, learned about what happened on the phone, and immediately dropped everything to return to his beloved wife. After a long period of rehabilitation, the mobility of the limbs never returned. The disease has severely distorted her speech. All that mattered to Winston was that his wife was alive. But it seemed to Mary that such an existence could not be called life. Winston treated her like a child. He was increasingly annoyed with her. At some point, she was very distant, refused to accept his help, so it was necessary to hire a nurse. In rare moments, when Mary's mood improved, he went into her room and read her long Arabian fairy tales. The woman would cry. Winston was confused. He realized that he was completely helpless in this situation. He even tried to go to a psychologist to establish a relationship with his wife, but everything was to no avail. Mary did not want to be a burden, so she gradually faded away. This went on for 10 years. And then one morning, 6th September 2012, Winston, as usual, went into the bedroom of his wife to say good morning, but was horrified to find her dead. Mary had drifted off to sleep. Her face was calm and even somehow happy. After hearing of his mother's death, Alex returned. The funeral was lavish. Say goodbye to Mary came all her former colleagues, numerous friends. Winston, however, the death of his beloved undermined. The man withdrew into himself, stopped all contact with society. He was horrified to realize that together with Mary went that part of him that made him enjoy every day. His son begged the old man to go with him to the capital, but for Winston such a thing was unacceptable. He took an interest in floriculture, began to grow in indoor greenhouses, his late wife's favorite flowers, lavender. And every year he carried fragrant bouquets to her grave. The old man sighed heavily as he finished his story. Joyce could see that the memories were causing him unbearable pain. She's been gone 10 years now. But I hope every time I hear her voice again, he said. I know what it's like, Joyce replied. My story, though not as romantic, is that when my husband left, my world literally turned upside down. For 4 years now I've been trying to cope with the loss, but I still can't get used to the fact that he's gone. Joyce, Winston said to her, thank you for listening to the old man's story. You're the first person I've been able to talk to so easily in 10 years. And, I'm relieved. Winston, this date, the 6th of September, is a fateful date, Joyce said thoughtfully. Did you meet Mary on that day? She fell ill and died on the same date. My husband died on the 6th of September, and you and I met on the same date. Don't you find that odd? I don't know, my dear, said the old man. I don't believe in mysticism, but I can't help thinking that maybe there is a connection. Winston, Joyce suddenly suggested, come and visit us on Sunday. It's my son's birthday. I'd love for you to meet the children, Joyce said. She felt sorry for the lonely old man, trapped in this huge flat, alone with his memories of his wife. She liked him very much, so she thought it was appropriate to invite him to the family party. I don't know, Winston replied uncertainly. Would I be in the way? Not at all. Joyce was quick to reassure him. Of course not. You're such an interesting man. I think it would be nice for you and my children to get to know each other. And you and I have a lot to talk about. Honestly, I can't stand to see you lonely. Please come. All right, the old man laughed in reply. I will. From then on, Winston became a frequent visitor to the Joyce family's flat. The children immediately fell in love with the elegant and talkative grandfather, who had stories for every occasion. They listened for hours about his expeditions, traveling to other countries. Often Winston invited them to his house. Catherine was captivated by the old man's library. Together with Elizabeth, they read French fairy tales, looking at ancient engravings depicting the stories. Grandfather, otherwise they did not call Winston, spoilt the children with sweets, showed the outlandish things brought by him from foreign trips. Joyce was happy to have such a friend in the family. They chatted constantly with Winston over coffee, discussing everything that could come to mind. As a conversationalist, the old man was unrivaled. He literally knew everything about everything. Gradually, Joyce got rid of the heavy burden of the past. One weekend, Winston came to visit and immediately took Joyce aside. Joyce, he began. We've been in touch for a long time, and I'm amazed at how much my life has been enriched by having someone so close to me in it. I can see how hard it must be for you to raise these wonderful children alone. Tell me honestly, are you happy with your life? I don't understand you, Winston. Joyce replied with embarrassment. Of course I'm content. I have beautiful children, a roof over my head, and now I've got a friend like that. I can't complain, can I? That's a good answer, Joyce smiled the old man. But that's not what I mean, Winston continued. Let me get this straight. Do you have enough to live on? Joyce opened her mouth, not knowing what to say. They had never discussed material matters. Well, Winston knew that she worked as a manager in a small firm. She'd never disclosed her salary, but it wasn't hard to guess that it was barely enough to support such a large family. The flat was in treacherous need of repairs. The car was literally screaming for emergency assistance. But did it matter? Joyce, Winston continued seriously. You may not say anything, but I'm not a fool. I can see this isn't easy for you. And frankly, it's a shame to see such a talented and versatile man wasting away in a hopeless job. That's why I have something to offer you. I've been talking to some of my old mates. Tell me, would you be interested in working in your specialty? What do you mean? Joyce was surprised. What do you mean? As a translator. Joyce, come on. There's a big company looking for a French translator. It's a prestigious job. It's a branch of a well-known French pharmaceutical company. Believe me, you'll be hired. I've already forgotten the language, Joyce mumbled embarrassedly. It's nothing, Winston hastened to reassure her. You speak perfectly well. You don't even have an accent. I know what I'm talking about. If you agree, come to the interview tomorrow. It's more of a formality, but you have to come and get acquainted. You can start work right away. Winston, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. If you're serious, of course I'll do it. What time tomorrow? Hang on, Joyce. Tomorrow's the 6th of September. Joyce was really enjoying her new job. She had to socialize with interesting people and regularly fly to France to accompany her boss. She had been in her position for 2.5 years. During this time, it turned out to be possible to establish a life. The children were transferred to a prestigious school. The eternal material problems fell away somehow by themselves. Even in her personal life, there was a shift. Joyce finally let Albert go, and one of her colleagues had a clear sympathy for her, which, to Joyce's surprise, turned out to be mutual on her part. One day her phone rang in the middle of the night, waking her from sleep. She did not immediately understand the meaning of what she heard. A familiar voice announced that Winston had passed away today. The old man had gone quietly, his heart stopping in his sleep. Joyce wept. Over the past few years, this elderly man had managed to become a true friend to her, even more a family man. But his passing had not caused hysteria. She was glad that at last this man would meet his beloved somewhere in heaven, where he stubbornly refused to believe with his mind, but recognized with his heart. Joyce helped with the funeral arrangements. Rummaging through the flat, she found a letter addressed to her, which Winston had apparently written shortly before his death. With trembling hands, she unsealed the envelope. Joyce pulled out a neatly written piece of paper. My dear Joyce, I didn't want to upset you prematurely, but I feel like I don't have much time left. I'm glad that at the end of my days, life has turned color again. Both you and your children are a real miracle. I have tried to do my best to help you deal with whatever has been keeping you from breathing fully. I want that from now on you have everything so that nothing will prevent you from developing and loving life. So please accept my humble gift for James and Elizabeth, because I know that for yourself you will refuse. With sincere respect and love for you. Winston. Joyce ran her hands over the sheet, not understanding what Winston meant. She was both happy and sad to receive such a message from him after he had gone. Soon Joyce forgot about the letter and plunged headlong into the abyss of everyday life. What was her surprise when 6 months later she received a call from the notary inviting her to attend the reading of Winston's will. At the appointed hour, the 6th of September, the woman entered the office, where she was informed that the last will of the deceased was to bequeath his flat to James, Elizabeth and Catherine Jones, and the library stored in it their mother Joyce Harrison.